It's an honor to be here, and I'm humbled to have been asked. And I've been telling my friends back home in New Brunswick that I'm going to Wisconsin to give a Milwaukee talkie. I'm sure I'm not the first person to use that very dumb little pun, but anyway. You are the experts in aging and in working with older adults and so forth, so I'm here as the egghead academic to offer some ideas and some concepts that may be helpful to you in your work and in your life. If you can see the picture on the top left, that's the province of New Brunswick, which is where I'm from, nestled between the state of Maine, province of Quebec, province of Nova Scotia. To the right is my town, Fredericton, New Brunswick, and the beautiful St. John River that flows through it. Rick, I think you've been there. And also St. Thomas University, which is where I'm based. So a couple of quotes here to get us in the mood. From Gustave Flaubert, the French novelist, "Everyone's life is worth a novel." From my friend and colleague Mark Freeman, "Our lives," he writes, "are like richly ambiguous texts to be interpreted and understood, whose meanings are inexhaustible, whose mysterious existence ceaselessly calls forth the desire to know, and whose readings cannot ever yield a final closure." And lastly, from the theologian Frederick Buechner, and maybe this really sets the tone, "Let us read with open minds the book our life is writing, and learn." So I'm not alone in my interest in narrative. We have a center for the interdisciplinary research on narrative. Karen Skerritt's been there. We call it CERN, not to be confused with the place in Sweden, or Switzerland rather, where they bang atoms together. But we do some nice things, and we have a variety of disciplines represented around the table on any given day. And speaking of disciplines, the ideas about narrative or story, and I'm going to use these two words quite interchangeably today, others wouldn't necessarily, to talk about how the thinking about life in narrative terms is not just something that we do in gerontology, but it's coming from a variety of academic disciplines: psychology, theology, ethics, etc. And those are some book covers there, which I'm not sure you can see, and I don't have those books here for your looking pleasure later today. So basically I've got two parts. I want to talk about some theory things, if you will, for the first part of the time I have, and then moving into this afternoon's more practical kinds of matters. I have some objectives here that I have assembled together. My main objective is to share some core ideas with you that I at least work with as a narrative gerontologist. There are other excellent narrative gerontologists, including Kate de Medeiros and others whom you're probably aware of, but you're going to get my particular take on the narrative gerontology thing. I'm going to try to offer a narrative perspective on aging and spirituality to entice you with some of the insights that surface when you start looking at life and aging and spirituality through a narrative lens. It's like you start to go down a whole bunch of fascinating rabbit holes. And I'm going to suggest some strategies for what we call narrative care with older adults. And this maybe will lend some added legitimacy, if it's needed, and I'm sure it isn't, to the kind of care that many of you provide older adults anyway. I have some assumptions which are kind of like my main points in a way. So if you get nothing else from what I say in the next couple of hours, then these assumptions are kind of the core. Stories are ubiquitous, and stories have power, for better or for worse. Our lives are shaped by and steeped in stories. And we have Art here with us as a talented storyteller, so he knows about this extremely well, I'm sure. I'm going to lean on this, if I may. Is that okay? Can you see me back there if I do that? Okay. Our lives are inseparable from our stories of our lives. We understand who we are in terms of our stories, not solely so. Memories, or at least autobiographical memories, are in many ways stories, and I like to say that autobiographical memory is a matter of faction. Our stories underlie our emotions, our beliefs, our relationships, our identities. I'll be saying more about that. Our stories of our lives are forever changing. And I think Eliot's wonderful poem alludes to that aspect of life. We're continually re-storying. Our stories of our lives can empower us, or they can also imprison us. But thinking of our lives as stories can in some ways be liberating. When I invite students to think of their life as a story at the age of 21 or whatever, they get excited about thinking about the different chapters that they've already lived through and the new chapters that await them. Our life stories are texts that it behooves us to read, particularly as we age. And maybe reading our life stories is critical to spiritual development. And, there we go. So there's always a story or two behind the things that interest us in life. And I have a bit of a story behind my interest in story. I have to be careful with this thing. It's tricky. I grew up as a PK. Everybody know what a PK is? Very good. There are some PKs here in the crowd, perhaps. And I grew up in a preacher's kid. I grew up in the maritime provinces of eastern Canada, which is a very lively narrative environment. My dad was a raconteur par excellence, and he called himself a community historian. Whenever he would start in a new parish as preacher, he would take time to get to know the stories of the people and of the community. My sister as well is a kind of a historian. I don't know if you can see these pictures very clearly, but on the top are some photographs of my family. My dad on the far left with a cup of coffee looking out over the fields at Mount Katahdin in northern Maine. He liked to take the long view of things. There's the family next to the right of him, my mom and dad, and then there's my dad with his good friend Garth and his special personal support worker, Renee. And this was in his final days in Windsor Court, which was a smaller version, I think, of St. John's on the Lake. But on the lower level, you'll see some of the books that my family members have written. Showers of Blessing is my dad's memoir. To the right of that is my sister Carol, who fell prey to polio at the age of 8 and has lived with that all of her life. She's writing her autobiography, and it's entitled Coming Full Circle, Diaries of a Polio Survivor. By that she means she's contracting or she's experiencing the effects of post-polio syndrome, which is not fun. But she's a strong person, and she has a strong story. To the far right is Dad's genealogical book called Guidelines to Our Ancestors, where he kind of traces the Randall family history back to the 1600s and my mother's family history back as far as he could, until he realized that Mother wasn't all that interested in history. In fact, she'd be along the lines of Henry Ford. History is bunk. So Dad, in a kind of a fit of decided to delete those sections of the book and then renamed the book Guidelines to My Ancestors. All right? So a few more things about me. Just to give you background, I got interested in narrative theology, as it was then being called, when I was in divinity school. I practiced parish ministry for about 11 years with the United Church of Canada. During that time, I listened to lots of people's stories, and I realized the healing power of just listening. When I returned to university in midlife, I decided to zero in on that, and I grew intrigued by the metaphor of life as a story. What's in that? I still am intrigued by that metaphor. I wrote a thesis which became a book called The Stories We Are, and there it is up on the upper left. And then I went to St. Thomas University in 1995 as a visiting chair in gerontology, which has been an incredible adventure. But I found that I started to react in the courses I was teaching. I began to react to the predominance of the biomedical healthcare paradigm of understanding what aging is about. And I found myself attracted, as others are here today, to a more humanities kind of paradigm, a literary, poetic one, which really is kind of a different starting point for thinking about aging. I began teaching a course called Narrative Gerontology, which I've been teaching every year for 24 years. I co-wrote a book with my colleague Elizabeth McKim, who is a literary scholar, called Reading Our Lives, The Poetics of Growing Old, and many of the ideas that I'm sharing with you today have started out in that book. I've been heartened in my neck of the woods by the mushrooming of life-writing groups of older adults. And here's my you can't see him very well, sadly, but Jean-Luc Guérin, originally from France, like Gustave Flaubert. I met him at an older adult conference in eastern New Brunswick, and he had just published his autobiography because he had been part of a group of life-writing folks throughout many Francophone communities called J'écris ma vie, I'm writing my life. So he wrote his life, published it as a book, and when I visited him and his wife Stella in their home a couple of months ago, he was working on another book. So he'd unleashed the narrative urge big time. I've had a chance to give some workshops on what I call the autobiographical adventure. I'm very interested in narrative resilience, in the value of having what I call a good, strong story, a thick, flexible, open story about our lives, and I'm interested in narrative care, which I'll say more about later. Also, of course, I'm obviously interested in the links between aging, spirituality, and narrative, which is why I'm here. And I'm semi-retired now, so I'm becoming very interested in the process of life review, which I would love to do in this room here. If you would all leave, take all the chairs and tables with you, and in a year or so, I'm going to fill a room like this up with all the cards and letters, as Dean Martin would say, and the photographs that I've accumulated across the decades of my life. Lay it all out and say, what was that all about? Try to make some sense of it. Maybe some of you are doing that exact same thing. So, with a tip of the hat to the mathematicians and the scientists here in the room, here's my Venn diagram to look at how spirituality, aging, and narrative, I think, are closely entwined. Or if you like the way Einstein might put it, S, spirituality equals aging to narrative squared. Okay, it's probably a very poor mathematical formula, but I like the look of it. So the first piece of the pie that I want to chat with you about today is aging and spirituality, because I see these three terms as intimately linked. I see aging as implicitly spiritual. I'm not alone in thinking that. And so I think gerontology needs theology as much as theology needs gerontology. There needs to be a meeting of the minds and the ideas and so forth. We do know from research that's been done that older adults who participate in spiritual practices or religious activities tend to live longer, healthier lives, better blood pressure, better cortisol readings, coping strategies, more social support, and so forth. I also tend, oh, happened, hello. I also believe, and this is Rabbi Shachter Shalomi, that aging brings with it a philosophic homework, okay? It's more than just brain fitness. Okay, brain fitness is good, but there's a philosophic homework, as he would call it, that brings us to a meeting like this today. And then, with deference to my colleague in gerontology, Rick Moody, aging is like a natural monastery. That's from your article on mysticism in that wonderful handbook that's featured here, Aging, Spirituality, and Religion. I think Susan McFadden has spoken at one of these events in the past, and I respect her work as well very, very much. But there's a number of books that are linking aging with spirituality, not necessarily, though, in the mainstream of gerontology, which is another whole discussion. But aging as a natural monastery, a very powerful image. This is a place I actually had a chance to visit as a tourist, Montserrat, high up in the mountains overlooking Barcelona, in Catalonia, or Spain if you prefer. Anyway, I didn't live there, but I thought it'd be a great place to have a mountaintop experience. So, with a nod of the head for sure to our speaker tomorrow, Thomas More, this is from his book, Care of the Soul. Growing old is one of the ways that the soul nudges itself into attention to the spiritual aspect of life. I just love that. You could meditate upon that. You could have a lectio divina just on that particular quotation. So aging nudges us, not forces us, but nudges us to become more down to earth. I mean, we do get shorter as we get older because of kyphosis and sarcopenia and all those wonderful sorts of things, okay? But I think there is a sense in which we have an opportunity to become, and many of us do, become more grateful, like my mom. Karen, did you meet my mom? Yeah, you did. This is my mom. She's 97. She's now living in the scaled-down version of St. John's in the Lake. And she said to me some time ago, she said, you know what? I feel like I'm already halfway in heaven. Okay. Why is that? Well, because she says, I feel like I'm surrounded by so many angels, by which she meant the good people in the buildings where she's been living, who look out for her, touch base with her, who call her, drop off cookies and whatever. Okay? And one of her angels is on the upper right picture here. It's Cindy, who's a checkout person at Sobeys grocery store. And the other day I took Mother to do something, and she said, can we stop at Sobeys? I don't need anything because my meals are all provided for, but I want to go in and see if Cindy's working. Maybe I can get a hug. So, and then she's fallen in love. Dad's passed away, so things are wide open for her. And so this is the guy with whom she has fallen in love. You recognize the picture, Chris Christopherson. Why has she fallen in love with him? Because of his song, Why Me, Lord? What have I ever done? We were driving back from Holton, Maine, a couple of days ago. She had wanted to go there for a Chinese lunch. And we were driving back, and I saved the best piece of music on the CD player for last. And it was this piece here, sung by Chris Christopherson himself, along with Willie Nelson and all those other guys. She was in tears, happy tears, because she feels, I'm 97, and here I am, surrounded by so many angels. Aging, I think, also becomes, it nudges us to become more far-sighted. I mean, literally, that happens. We can see things better out that way than we can close up, okay? To take the long view, as my father would like to say. It invites us also, or it nudges us to tolerate paradox and ambiguity and the gray areas, which is a kind of a topic area referred to by some psychologists of aging as post-formal thinking. It nudges us to control our emotions better. Here I have some pictures. I don't know if you can see them. You know, early in life, we don't control our emotions quite so well. But as we get older, and this is the whole, one of the topic areas that I find absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure Rick and others here today have been looking into this, the development of our emotional lives and the complexity thereof. And I'd like to say the narrative dimensions of that emotional complexity as we age. Aging nudges us to lighten up, to be gently ironic, to see the positives. That's called the positivity bias by psychologists of aging. To let go, to declutter, to focus on what matters. I spent a good chunk of January with my sister helping to get rid of stuff that was in my mother's apartment when she made the move. And I vowed religiously to start the decluttering process myself. And I'm very proud to say that I've taken about 18 boxes of books and clothes and whatever to Value Village, to the Sally Ann, to wherever. Just, it's like Marie Konto. Who's it? Yes. I feel happy, you know. It's a wonderful feeling. Aging nudges us to turn inward, to nurture an inner life, to age in depth, as one saying has put it. And here's a little story for you from my ministry days. It was a Saturday afternoon in August. I wanted to be at the lake having a nice cold beer, and the phone rang, and I was asked to go to the home of Mr. Kane because he was dying. So I went to the home of Mr. Kane. His wife opened the door and immediately rushed me into the master bedroom where he lay on his bed, okay, still conscious. His first words to me were, "I'm ready to go." Another parishioner in Fredericton named Jim, he wasn't the sort of person who read the Bible a lot, as far as I could tell. To visit him one day, to have lunch with him and his wife, and there was the Bible sitting on the reading table. I said, "Hey, Jim, what's going on here, you know?" "Oh," he says, "I'm cramming for my finals." Aging nudges us to step back, to take stock, to engage in life review. I like to say it nudges us to pull ourselves together. Pull yourself together. Aging does that. It invites us to make peace with our past, to prepare for our future, and to identify our own unique wisdom, whether it's through poetry or stories or conversation or writing, because I think wisdom and story are closely linked. And jumping over a few things here for the interest of time, but I do believe that aging does nudge us to grow into the role of spiritual elder. And thank goodness there are a lot of organizations and institutions these days that are focusing on that very thing. Okay? Here's where I like the work of Florida Scott Maxwell. Hands, those of you are somewhat familiar with her work. She wrote a little book when she was apparently in her 80s and living in a place like St. John's on the Lake, and she kept a diary, which she referred to one place as her wailing wall. She would write thoughts, whatever, in it as they struck her. And this is one of the thoughts that she wrote. You need only claim the events of your life to make yourself yours. When you truly possess all you've been and done, which may take some time, you are fierce with reality. When the last age has assembled you together, will it not be easy to let it all go? Lived, balanced, over. You could have a whole Lectio Divina conversation or session just on that quotation alone. By the way, I do have copies. I see some of you trying to write things down. I have some copies of these PowerPoint slides, which I hope we can make available to you if you wish.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome very much. If you really like Scott Maxwell, I got some more quotations for you, which I won't read, but she does say, a long life makes me feel nearer truth, but I won't go into words. And she says, aging is a time of discovery. Those are quotations that I could sink my teeth into for a couple of hours. Finally, aging nudges us to grow old and not just get old. May Sarton talks about growing old versus withering. Okay? And she's not talking about the physical withering. Okay? She's talking about some other kind of withering. Aging nudges us to experience age as an adventure. You may be familiar with that wonderful book by Betty Friedan called The Fountain of Age. She has a whole chapter, Age as Adventure, which I find very inspiring. My students find it very long, but I find it very inspiring. I think aging nudges us to upgrade our experience of faith and also perhaps our structure of belief or our concept of God. However we might define that big word. And here's where I'm drawn to the little saying out of a book that I ran across when I was in divinity school and in ministry by the New Testament translator J.B. Phillips. The book's called Your God is Too Small. And he has this wonderful thing to say in the preface. He says, many men and women today, this is back in the 50s, are living often with inner dissatisfaction without any faith in God at all. Not because they're particularly wicked or selfish, but because they have not found with their adult minds a God big enough to account for life, big enough to fit in with the new scientific age, big enough to command their highest admiration and respect, and consequently their willing cooperation. Along the same lines, but from a very different source, from Carl Sagan, in his novel Contact, which was made into a movie that I've watched I don't know how many times, starring Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey. You may recall the story. It's a science fiction story. Matthew McConaughey plays the part of a televangelist who's advising the president. Do we have that nowadays? I'm not sure. Anyway, this televangelist who falls in love with the astronomer, and she with him, says to her one day, because she's quite skeptical about all this religious stuff, he says to her, any faith that admires truth, any faith that strives to know God, must be brave enough to accommodate the universe. I mean the real universe. All those light years, all those worlds. So, next piece of the pie. Spirituality and narrative. Well, spirituality, as we know, is a complex matter. Perhaps it's broader than religion. I think whatever else it is, it's related to meaning-making, particularly existential meaning-making. And guess what? Narrative happens to be one of our key means of making meaning. Stuff happens to us in our lives, and the first thing we want to do is tell somebody the story so we can sort it out, make sense of it. Perhaps storytelling itself, perhaps storytelling itself is implicitly spiritual. There's a quotation here from James Carroll, the communion of sinners. The very act of storytelling is by definition holy. Art. To enter another's life story is to enter a holy space. Karen Scheib of Emory University. In your own stories where you'll find your truth. Robert Atkinson, The Gift of Stories. So I like to also point out that spirituality, however we define it precisely, is experienced through and not despite our stories. If you hear a sermon or a homily or a talk that really moves you, or a prayer that really speaks to you, it's because it taps into something in your unique life, a set of memories, an accumulation of feelings, an issue, whatever. Okay? Spiritual development, I think, is closely linked to autobiographical development. Here I'm referring to an article by John Stout called Autobiography is Spiritual Practice. I love that kind of thing. Spiritual traditions, and I'm going to say more about this shortly, provide us with meta-narratives or master narratives to live by, or maybe to live within. Whatever our spiritual tradition might be. Okay? Spiritual traditions, and I can speak best about Christianity because that's where I am rooted, as a master narrative or as a meta-narrative, is something that we often absorb by osmosis early in life, for better or for worse. I know I did as a preacher's kid. I didn't have much choice. And they become woven into what my colleague Mark Freeman would call our narrative unconscious. They are certainly structures for meaning, for morality, and for coherence because they offer us ready-made answers, not quite so ready-made, but a set of answers, if you will, to the perennial questions: who am I, where have I come from, where am I going? They provide us with narrative templates for thinking about our lives and about life in general. And they provide us with an overarching account of ourselves and our world, a worldview, as we say. So, whatever your particular spiritual tradition might be, you can think of it as a narrative environment that you live within. I'm going to say more about narrative environment a little later. And they can be either astonishing resources or imprisoning structures. This is the work of William Beardsley. And they have a lot of counter and competing stories operating within them. If you've ever been to a synod meeting or gone to a seminary for very long, you're well aware with the competing narratives that can be at work with respect to major points of doctrine, etc. Okay? And I like to think that perhaps nowadays we have many people understandably viewing and experiencing spiritual traditions as in an ironic kind of way. And draw from them in a syncretistic or eclectic kind of way. I have a colleague, a dear friend of mine, who draws from the Catholic tradition that he was rooted in, reading Thomas Merton and Henry Nouwen, but he also reads Thich Nhat Hanh, he reads Eckhart Tolle, he practices Tai Chi, he's drawn to ideas from indigenous spirituality, that do-it-yourself type of spirituality that I think is fine, quite fine. And the master narratives of spirituality intersect within us with other master narratives. For example, that of science itself. Science itself you can think of as an unfolding narrative. And here's the work of Lynn McTaggart from Scotland. And she says in the book, The Field, is that okay as a Scottish accent? She says, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. But of all of our stories, it's the scientific ones that most define us. I'm not quite sure about that. Those stories create our perception of the universe and how it operates. Although we perceive science as an ultimate truth, science is finally just a story told in installments. Okay, the big chapters in the scientific story: Galileo, upgraded by Newton, Einstein, Heisenberg, Hawking's. The story continues. I'm not going to talk about narrative theology, but I would like to. But in the interest of time, I'm going to cut through this particular slide. As I say, when I started my theological studies, I became very interested in what was being tentatively called narrative theology. H. Richard Niebuhr was one of the spokespeople, if you will, of that, or one of the sources. Robert McCaffey Brown, Sally Tassell, there's a whole group of them, particularly in the late 70s and so forth. I want to go back to those sources and figure out what they were saying and update myself. But I like to think that to convert, to use that term conversion, if someone converts to, let's say, Christianity, it's like they're taking their version of their life story and aligning it with a version of, shall we say, the Christian story. And there's a convergence of versions. That's a kind of a goofy sort of play on words sort of thing, but I think there's something in there to be explored. We talk, our fundamentalist friends will talk about, I was once blind, but now I can see. A sudden shift in their understanding of who they are, where they've come from, where they're going. An idea that I do play around with, and I'm not going to today because it takes us down another rabbit hole, but I'm intrigued by it, especially after a marvelous session this morning, which I recommend to others, Lectio Divina with Michael and Kathy. From a narrative perspective, where you read a piece of scripture, not to analyze its content or debate its ideas, but to meditate upon it and let it sort of wash through you. That's what we did. It was wonderful. There's another whole story to that. Because the passage that we chose, trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not to thine own understanding, that was exactly the very first phrase that my father taught me. And I couldn't believe the synchronistic experience that I felt this morning to know that was, of all the passages that they might have chosen from the Old Testament, boom, that was the one. But I like to think that our own stories, the texts of our own lives, are sacred texts, can be read in a Lectio Divina kind of way, and are parabolic. This idea of our life stories as parabolic, as parable-like, that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down, but maybe we can go down it during the Q&A time if we have some. Oh dear. Oh gosh. Sorry. I'm not sure I'm going to get this right. My ear was moving independently of the rest of my head. This quotation, again, it kind of sums up what I hope to get to a little bit later on in my thinking about our life stories themselves. If you've been writing your autobiography or memoir, you probably had a taste of this experience, that you uncover stuff in wading through the details and the facts and the dates of your life. You discover deeper things, themes, trends, and questions that you can be pondering forever, as parables tend to invite us to do. So here's Mark Freeman again. Our lives are like richly ambiguous texts to be interpreted and understood, whose meanings are inexhaustible, whose mysterious existence ceaselessly calls forth the desire to know, whose readings cannot ever yield a final closure. That can be frustrating for some people. We want closure, perhaps. We want to get it all nailed down, get answers. I don't think, personally, that that's how it works, and I like his way of looking at things. Spirituality and narrative, I'm not going to get down to this. This is another rabbit hole about the idea of the key to aging could be argued as having a good, strong story about our lives. By strong, I don't mean rigid and inflexible. I mean resilient and flexible. And in the same way that an oak tree or a pine tree is flexible, blows back and forth with the hurricane winds, and doesn't fall over. Okay. We were doing a research project at St. Thomas University. Sorry, I'm not looking at you over there. I apologize. We're doing a project where it's kind of a simple little project where we've decided to interview a whole bunch of people 65 and over to tell us their life story and see if there's any correlation between how they tell their story and how they score on measures of resilience. And this is preliminary data only, but we're finding that there is a trend. Those people who score high on resilience, regardless of what sorts of adversities they've gone through, and they've gone through all kinds of stuff, let me tell you, they score very high in resilience because they say things like, I got a story to tell. One woman said in the interview, I want to write my story someday. It's going to be a trilogy plus. So it's like that sense of, I got a story. I'm really excited about the life I've lived, albeit with all of the difficulties and ups and downs and losses of husbands and this and that I've experienced. So narrative and aging. Now we're getting to the nub of things, okay? Here is where, it's the third piece of the pie, by the way, if you're following the pie. Are we having pie for lunch? Because I like to think in terms of pie. The very first quote up here, which you probably can't see terribly well, is from the English professor turned psychotherapist named William Bridges in his book Transitions, came out in 1970-something. He says, we're like stories that are slowly unfolding according to our own inner theme and plot. Each person's life is a story that's telling itself in the living. He also says in another place that to get involved with somebody as a couple is to agree implicitly to live in terms of another person's story. Although he says it sometimes takes quite a while to get the part down really well. The last quotation there is one I use often in workshops and with my students from Alex Haley, author of Roots. Every time an old person dies, he said once in an interview, it's like a library burns down. Yeah. There's another Lectio Divina text that you could work on, okay? So aging is a multi-dimensional process, and it's also a biographical process. Those of us who play around with narrative gerontology, we like to make the distinction between biological aging and biographical aging, or autobiographical aging. And yet aging is, you know better than I do perhaps, is widely perceived in the media and in everyday, parlance in terms of physical and medical issues as a problem to be solved. Thomas Cole used that phrase. Aging gets perceived in a default kind of way as a problem to be solved. The narrative of decline, to quote Margaret Morgenroth Goulet, dominates our story, personal story often, of what aging is about. And so because of that, the emotionally, cognitively, and narratively complex inside of aging is all but eclipsed. And with it, topics like meaning and wisdom and spirituality, which is where I really like a narrative gerontology because it opens a space where we can think about these sorts of things. For example, wisdom. From a narrative perspective, wisdom can be seen as linked to cultivating thick, rich stories of our lives, to keeping our stories open, and to reading our lives. And here's where Ruth Ray, some of you may be familiar with her book Beyond Nostalgia. She was a English professor at Wayne State University, but she was also a gerontologist, okay? And in her wonderful book, Beyond Nostalgia, based upon her participatory research with older adults in Detroit, in inner city situations, primarily older women, they were writing their life stories. And she wrote the book on the basis of her findings. And here's what she says. A person is truly wise when she's able to see life as an evolving story and to create some distance between self and story by reflecting on it from multiple perspectives. Wise people watch themselves tell life stories, learn from other stories, and intervene in their own narrative processes to allow for change by admitting new stories and new interpretations into their repertoire. Again, we could take a whole day and think about that. Here's some books on narrative and aging, including Kate Medeiros' great book, Narrative Gerontology, on the lower tier. Some of the books I've had a hand in. Jim Bieran's book, Telling, what's it called? Telling the Stories of Life Through Guided Autobiography, the late Jim Bieran. So what does a narrative perspective on aging see? Well, a narrative perspective sees that we humans are hermeneutical beings. There's a word that you may have heard if you ever went to divinity school, okay? We're makers of meaning. We're interpretive beings, okay? Unlike the squirrels that come to my bird feeder and stare at me defiantly and say, I got here first, okay? I don't think that they think a lot, but I don't know. I can't penetrate the density of squirrel language. It doesn't seem to me that they spend a lot of time musing on the meaning of what's happening in their lives. They may do, and I'll find out later in some other life. But narrative, as I've said before, is our main means of making meaning. The narrative impulse, it's been argued by many sources, is hardwired into us. Our brains are hardwired. I'm not a neuroscientist. I probably need one, but I'm not one. Are arguing in some circles that, you know what, our brains are hardwired to think in terms of stories. Stuff happens in our lives, and we make stories of that stuff. So narrative thought or narrative intelligence is a kind of core type of cognition that we're capable of. And we haven't looked at it too much. Jerome Bruner, a key figure in narrative psychology, stepped back from his involvement in cognitive science at one point and says, wait a second, we're overlooking in our quest for how logical thinking and scientific thinking works and should work and how we can teach it to other people. We forget that there's a type of thinking that we all do every day of life. It's called, and he called it narrative thinking or narrative thought. And that unleashed a whole bunch of scholarship which we're still experiencing the excitement of. So we're homo narrans, forever storying the stuff of our lives, but not all of it. That's the key. Our key autobiographical memories or episodic memories, the kinds of things that we tend to write about in our memoirs, are, I think, in some ways anomalies. They're the things we can't forget. They're the stories about times when something went wrong, when our expectations weren't met, such as, for me, yesterday. May I tell you this story? I was on my way, happily, blindly, from Fredericton, New Brunswick to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. All right? Arrive in the Toronto airport, and the announcement, the Milwaukee flight has been canceled. Sybil knows about this, Kent knows about this, all right? So what happens? Well, we scurry around, some of us, there's like 2 or 3 of us in particular. We get on a flight as the standby customers to Chicago. Get in Chicago, how are we going to get from Chicago to Milwaukee, particularly St. John's on the Lake? Well, one of them says, I'm going to order an Uber. All right, order an Uber. Never been in an Uber before. And we came all the way from O'Hare to here in an Uber. We split the cost. It was wonderful. I now have 3 new friends, Mohammed, the driver, Fabiano, the guy from Italy originally but now lives in Brazil, and AJ, who's my new best friend. He's going with a Yukon girl who's Canadian. So the stories were just flying around, and I got out of that car higher than a kite on life, okay? I had an adventure, all right? I tried to make a lemonade out of the lemon. But I will forget all of the airplane rides, perhaps, that I've had in my life, except the time I went to Milwaukee, St. John. So you're indelibly etched in my memory forever, okay? There's a little game that we play sometimes in my courses and classes. I call it the ABCs of autobiographical memory. I write up on the board the word apple, A-P-P-L-E. And I say, anybody out there got an apple story? I'd ask it here right now, but I think we'd unleash the floodgates of stories and we wouldn't come back to task. It would be fun. So one person, oh yes, I remember as a kid growing up in western Wisconsin, we would go to the UPEC, as a family. Oh, well, I remember, another person said, I remember when grandmother taught me how to bake an apple pie. Oh, I remember we used to have apple fights with the rotten apples in October, okay? So stories breed stories, and within minutes, a group of otherwise strangers become sort of friends, okay? The next word, bike, triggers the same sort of little story. Then cat, A-B-C, you get it, okay? And I use that exercise because it shows you how stories breed stories. There's an energy that's unleashed, usually a positive kind of energy that can be used to your benefit when you're trying to teach folks stuff, okay? So our bodies themselves are living history books. We must never forget that our stories are embodied. The lines on our faces tell stories. The postures and gestures that we have tell stories all their own, okay? And then lastly on this little slide, every one of us is living in our own story world. Have you had somebody say to you once, you live in your own little world? Well, it's true. We do all live in our own little, I call it story world, okay? So the story world of you and you and you is as different from you and you and you as mine is from you and you and you, okay? In the same way that the novelists that we like to read have different story worlds that they invite us into. It's been said of the novelist Graham Greene that it was a kind of a critical comment that every time you read a novel or a short story by Graham Greene, you enter Greenland. Because they have the same kind of feel to them. The characters are very similar. The themes are maybe different and so forth, but it's the same sort of world, okay? And this relates to what I call storying style. We each have our own unique storying style, develops from younger age and goes on till later age. I noticed this difference in storying styles a few years ago before my dad passed away. I realized that he had a certain way of telling stories about his life. And in the stories that he liked to tell about his life, he was always the smart kid. He was the one that knew what had to be done. He was the one that could figure out a strategy to deal with the bully on the playground. He was the one. He didn't say these stories in a bragging kind of way, but the message was, yeah, I'm smart. I have a wisdom, which I respect. I realize, though, that I tend to tell the opposite kind of stories. In the stories I tend to tell about my life, I'm the chump. I'm the fool. I'm the dummy. All right? Why do I tell those kinds of stories? My psychiatrist will tell you. But I think it partly is because those sorts of stories seem to disarm other people, and we can connect more easily. We get a chuckle out of it, and away we go. Okay? I'm not saying that Dad didn't have friends and didn't get chuckles, but different storying styles, if you get my point. All right? So I think that's kind of why we quite naturally engage in story talk. The metaphor of life as story is actually quite prevalent. Think of all the different sayings that you've heard or used across the years, such as, it's the story of my life. Or, same old story. Or if I start going with Bob and stop going with Jack, I'll be opening up a new chapter. Can you think of some other sayings that are suggested by this life as story sort of metaphor? We're on the same page. I want to turn over a new leaf. Or someone will say to me, you can ask me any question you want to because my life is an open book. I always am kind of skeptical about that, but that's their prerogative. So a narrative perspective sees us as swimming in stories and shaped by stories. And here's the weird notion that I like us to dwell upon, is that our lives are messy, quasi-literary novels that we are continually composing from inside as sort of simultaneously the author or co-author, narrator, editor, protagonist, and reader kind of all at once. It's a weird notion, but once you start to play with it, it's quite a bit of fun. And that's actually what was at the heart of my book, The Stories We Are. I like to think of the novelty of our lives, okay? They're unique, but they're also like these vast, sprawling, multi-plotted stories. So we're one story, but we're also many. And we have many different types of story in the library that Alex Haley speaks of. Okay, we've got short stories, the story about what we did last evening. The long stories about the first marriage. Okay, we've got subplots and chapters. We've got stories about the past, stories about the future. We've got if only stories and might be stories. We've got fuzzy, focused stories, surface, deep. We've got public, private, big, small. In the world of narrative psychology, there's a lot of debate these days between big stories and small stories. We could get into that, but there's another whole rabbit hole. We've got stories that we can tell and stories we don't know how to tell, that are untold. And we have secret stories, but we also have signature stories. This is my term. It kind of goes along with what Jefferson Singer would call self-defining memories, I think, Karen. What's a signature story? A signature story is a story that we tend to like to tell about our lives when maybe we're meeting people for the first time. Out comes one of our signature stories because it portrays us in a sort of a positive light and enables us to make an impression on somebody that we want them to have. But our signature stories have a lot going on within them, and I'd like to tell you one of mine. When I was 2 years of age, I had polio, as did my older sister, who still wrestles with the ravages of polio. And I had polio of the diaphragm, so I had difficulty breathing, and I was put for 2 weeks in an iron lung. Okay? In St. John, New Brunswick, a foggy port city, not particularly attractive hospital. There I was 2 weeks. Not much of a story, more just a kind of an image in a way. But I've told that little story, I don't know how many times, at parties, boring parties maybe, or parties when you wanted to get a little bit of attention over the punch bowl, and the conversation turned to life-threatening diseases or accidents that we'd had. Out would come my iron lung story. Yeah, I was in an iron lung once for 2 weeks. I was 2 years old. What? That usually stops everything, and I get all the attention. Yeah, well, what are you going to do, Some years later, I had been studying in Toronto, and I went back to New Brunswick to hang out with my parents for a couple of weeks on holiday. And we were sitting at Harvey Lake on a beautiful summer afternoon, having a glass of something, I'm not sure. And I wanted to convey to them, because I've been away for quite some time, I wanted to convey to them how deeply appreciative I was for all the sacrifices that they had made for us kids, particularly with the polio and all that sort of thing. And so I said that to them, thank you so much. Yeah, well, those were rough times. Your mother had a lot of surgery that we had to pay for, and I had to work extra jobs outside of being a minister, and there wasn't a lot of Medicare coverage. And then I said, yeah, it must have been really tough for you when I was in that iron lung for 2 weeks. Silence. Sorry, what are you talking about? I was in the iron lung for 2 weeks. Where did you get that idea? You were never in an iron lung. And I start to think, okay, we're dealing with false memory syndrome here. And they've got it, not me. Anyway, I had to concede that they probably were right, because I was only 2, and what did I know? And they were my parents. So I had to accept that no, the story was not true. So I began to feel this wave of guilt. I have to go back to all those parties and tell all those people that I was wrong. Please forgive me. Fake news. So now I can't tell the story as a signature story. It's now a story about stories. And I bet you we all have some stories like that, which I hope you'll share with each other over lunch or coffee or whatever, okay? Because our stories about ourselves tell us a lot about ourselves. Patricia Hampel, who's a memoirist some of you may be familiar with, she says, it's important to tell our stories, but it's also important to listen to what our stories tell us. And when you write your autobiography or memoir, I'm sure you're experiencing some of that. So, moving right along. And I'm going to cut some corners here for sure. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is the quotation from Mark Freeman, who says that later life is in many ways the narrative phase par excellence. The work of Gene Cohen, among others, suggests that our aging brains themselves have better cooperation between right hemisphere and left hemisphere, and one of the results of that is an intensification of the autobiographical impulse. Okay? That urge to get the story out. You made that very clear, Art, in your introductory remarks. As well, I like to think of later life as having unique developmental tasks. Are you familiar with that sort of language from your Psychology 101 course days? Right? So when you're 2 or 3 years of age, your developmental tasks are things like learning how to walk and talk and go to the potty on your own. Right? And we have other developmental tasks that are quite obvious, perhaps when we get into our adolescent years. But in later life, no less, there are still developmental tasks, and that's what I want to be focusing on as we get into the rest of this morning and start into this afternoon. Quotation from Dan McAdams. Some of you will be very familiar with the work of Dan McAdams, just down the road at Northwestern. I haven't had the chance to meet him yet, but I'm hoping that will happen. We have a conference coming up in 2020 in Atlanta called Narrative Matters 2020. And I'd like to think we could get somebody like Dan to come and give us a keynote speech about his important work in narrative psychology. He's written books like The Redemptive Self, and he wrote a book recently about George W. Bush, and where the theme of redemption comes from. Anyway, the point I'm trying to say is that he, in one of his other books, says, working with that concept that we get from Erik Erikson, identity, okay? Identity, says McAdams, is a life story, which he defines as an internalized and evolving narrative or personal myth that provides us with a sense of unity, meaning, and purpose. So when somebody asks you, tell me about yourself, are you going to give them a bunch of statistics? Well, I'm 5'6", I weigh 132 pounds, I take a shoe size whatever, belt size whatever. You don't give them a bunch of statistics, you give them a story. Well, I was born at a very young age in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and By the way, I learned a word last night from AJ in the Uber cab. Cheeseheads. Is it okay to use that word here? It isn't, I know. And so it's equally wrong for you to use this word about me as a New Brunswicker. New Brunswickers are called herring chokers. All right? Okay. So Dan McAdams links the concept of identity to stories. Who you are, and this is my book, The Stories We Are, who you are is linked to the stories that you develop over the years about who you are, where you've come from, where you're going. And so identity and narrative development continues all life long. The whole identity, narrative, self-story connection is far from straightforward. A lot of complexities to it, which we could talk about over lunch. So I want to talk now about narrative development. How are we doing? Well, I want to tip my hat to a leader in the field of narrative thinking, Jerome Bruner. Jerome Bruner, it was to psychology, I think, as Jim Bieran was to gerontology in some way. They both have the same initials, conveniently. But Jerome Bruner, who, by the way, gave a keynote address at a Narrative Matters conference in Paris, France in 2012, and it was brilliant as ever. Okay? He died, I think, a year or so ago at the age of 100 or so. But one of his articles, which I highly recommend to those of you who want to delve into the narrative world more deeply, is a 1987 article called Life as Narrative. And he talks about narrative thought versus logical thought. But he has this wonderful thing to say here, which I'm going to quote. He says, we become the autobiographical narratives by which we tell about our life. I cannot imagine a more interesting project than one that addresses itself to the development of autobiography, how our way of telling about ourselves changes, and how these accounts come to take control of our ways of life. This is an interesting way of thinking about the developmental process, a development in terms of the stories that we go through about who we are, where we've come from, where we're going. Which brings me to these pictures here. I'm sorry that you can't see this terribly clearly, but in the upper left corner is moi, age 7 or 8, I'm not sure exactly. Billy Randall, black and white photograph, out in front of Al Knowlton's General Store in downtown metropolitan Harvey Station, New Brunswick, population 302. And I don't know if you can see that. Maybe those of you who are up front, you can see I got arms akimbo. And there's a look on my face which conveys I'm not sure what emotion. Maybe it's some pouting because I wanted that chocolate bar and Mommy's not going to buy it for me. Or I don't want to go to school. Or I got to pee or something like that. Whatever. And when going through my father and mother's stuff in January, we came across a letter or a photocopy of an actual letter that I wrote on my 8th birthday. I got to read a portion of it to you because it makes me wonder, who was that little kid that's somehow still crawling around inside of me? Here's the letter. December 1st, 1958. My mother, like perhaps your mother, always had us write bread and butter letters after Christmas and birthday. Presents, got to sit down and write a letter. Okay. So, dear Aura and Sheldon, these were family friends of ours, didn't have kids of their own, so they gave us some nice presents. Dear Aura and Sheldon, I thank you an awful lot for the gun and holster with 43 bullets. Do you know on TV that show Have Gun Will Travel? I think it is his pair. It's a real good gun. You can flash draw. Daddy said we could try practicing at Grammy's Pictures. The same daddy who taught me, trust in the Lord with all your heart and trust not you. I don't think we did that, but and I don't think at the time I appreciated the irony and the humor in it. I thought I could actually fire at Grammys, not his mother, but my mother's mother. So on the upper right, you've got a picture of me wearing a clerical collar with a poppy on my lapel because it was Remembrance Day in Canada. All right. And I'm there with my mom and dad. I was ministering in a rural church in Ontario somewhere. And then lower right is a picture of me about 20 years ago after I'd bought a new house. My parents came to give me kind of a little house warming party. But each of those pictures reflects a different stage in my autobiographical development. And it's hard for me at this point in my life to crawl back inside of those successive previous me's that I was and have a sense of what was the story I was telling myself then about who I was, where I'd come from, where I was going. Okay? That's the kind of thing I think Jerome Bruner was saying that this would be a really interesting longitudinal project. So we develop in lots of ways. We develop physically, sexually, emotionally, cognitively, relationally, professionally, spiritually, but also narratively. And that's where I'm moving now. So our stories are not static, but they're thickening and evolving and complexifying with time. We're continually adding new episodes. When you move from wherever you were before, perhaps to living in St. John's on the Lake, it was a new chapter, right? And you closed off perhaps, or sort of closed off a previous chapter, but you knew that your story had taken a different turn. Here's the point, though. It's rather interesting. Our stories, says Charlotte Lind, our stories are structurally and interpretively open. We're not just adding new subplots. We're adding perhaps new layers of interpretation as we go forward. The same as you do when you're reading a novel that holds your attention, okay? Yes, the events change, but your understanding of what the events mean is continually changing in very complex, subtle ways. So the real past is fixed, but the remembered past is fluid. New meanings, this is Ruth Ray, new meanings can always be gleaned from old tales. When I think back to that iron lung story, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of that over the years. Thinking about it. It doesn't change the fact that I wasn't actually in the iron lung. I apparently was in an oxygen tent, which seems pretty unsexy by comparison. But thinking about why have I held on to that story, told that, what's in it for me, I can get no end of meanings and thoughts and questions and insights about myself from that. So the meaning of the past develops through life, says one philosopher. I think there's so much in that. We're continuously storying and restorying our identity. In the same way, and we never quite exhaust all the meanings that we could get. So we might reach the end of a novel, but if it's a novel worth its salt, there's no end of meanings to be gleaned from it. Okay? And I think our own life stories are something along that line. So there's no intrinsic end to narrative development. Here's May Sarton. Any of you familiar with the journals of May Sarton? Oh, good. The past, she says, is always changing in one of her journal entries. It's never static, never placed forever like a book on a shelf. As we grow and change, we understand things in new ways. As life goes on, it becomes more intense because there are tremendous numbers of associations and so many memories. I assume we've all had a taste of that kind of feeling if we've done some autobiographical reflection. This is another powerhouse mind in the world of narrative psychology, Donald Polkinghorne, and in his masterful book, Narrative Knowing in the Human Sciences, which is a must-read if you go further into the narrative world, he says, we live immersed in narrative, and recounting and reassessing the meanings of our past actions, anticipating the outcomes of future projects, situating ourselves at the intersection of several stories not yet completed. We are in the middle of our stories and can't be sure how they will end. We're continually having to revise the plot, remember that phrase, as new events are added to our lives. Maybe you've had an event recently, a significant event, positive or negative, that's been nudging you, to use Thomas More's word, that's been nudging you to revise the plot of your life and where it's come from, where it's going. You're not quite sure how to do that. Poetry lovers, we must have them here. Yes, Eliot for sure, and others as well. Do you know this from the American poet Oliver Wendell Holmes? This, to me, with its spiral structure depicted in the pictures here, and the poem itself, is a wonderful way of metaphoricalizing the notion of narrative development. Okay, because we come back around from a broader perspective. We come back around to some of the themes that intrigued us or that we wrestled with earlier in life. So here, I'll read it for you. Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul, as the swift seasons roll. Leave thy low vaulted past, let each new temple nobler than the last shut thee from heaven with a dome more vast, till thou at length are free, leaving thine outgrown shell by life's unresting sea. Another Lectio Divina poem to ponder. So I'm going to jump over the work of Dan McAdams, not because it's unimportant, but because I want to zero in on some other things. But I do point you to his work because it really is very important in scoping out the territory of the narrative complexity of human life, identity, and development. These are some of the books that he has had a hand in, and I can't recommend them to you highly enough. He has he has a quotation. He says, the development of identity across the lifespan and into later life, he assumes, I think too, should ideally move in the direction of increasingly good narrative form. Now, this is a controversial idea I'm not quite sure about, and he lays out 6 different criteria for what he calls a good life story. And there's a lot of debate these days as to what do we mean by a good life story, particularly when it comes to things like dementia, etc. A story must hang together, it must have some coherence, it must be open, or it should be open, it should be credible. You can't have a life story that's based on fake news and false facts about your life, okay? And it would be good if it had a lot of things going on, it had a differentiation component to it, that it has a capacity to reconcile, to pull in the good, the bad, and the not so good of our lives, the traumatic, the troublesome, and so forth, and if it had a quality of what he calls generative integration. But just to cut past those, I do want to point to this, I think, kind of helpful scheme that lays the groundwork for what we're now going to be looking into in the rest of my time. In an article in 1996 in a book that Gary Kenyon edited, and Jim Bieran, called Aging and Biography, which is kind of a groundbreaking text, I think, in that way of thinking about aging. Dan McAdams has a book called a chapter called Narrating the Self in Adulthood, and he throws out, here's a developmental psychologist who's used to thinking in terms of stages and so forth, and we can view those somewhat skeptically, I know, but he says, well, let's think about the pre-mythic stage, the mythic stage, and the post-mythic stage. What's the pre-mythic stage is when we're little kids, 8 years old and younger, and he says we're unwittingly gathering material. Like my iron lung story, okay? Got gathered up in those early years somehow or other, and it's become a key theme or a key episode perhaps in the adult story that I've gone on to tell and shared with you today. The mythic stage begins kind of around adolescence when a lot of other things are going on, and we're testing the bounds of the authorities in our lives and so forth. But we're also taking autobiographical agency in our lives, starting to figure out what's my story of me as opposed to mom and dad's story of me, or my teacher's stories of me, or my chum's story of me. And that can be very, 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 cause a lot of upheaval in families, okay? But the mythic stage, McAdams suggests, continues on into early adulthood, midlife, as we're continually adding plot lines and themes and adventures and so forth, the plot's thickening, if you will. Then he says the post-mythic stage, and he doesn't specify when exactly that would begin, is kind of in later life, okay? When the impulse to look back tends to be more often experienced than the tendency to look forward. When we're inclined to review, reflect upon the life that we have lived. It can also be a stage when the plot's thinning and the narrative environments that we live within are shrinking a little bit. It can be a narrowing time, but also, I think, an opening out sort of time. So bottom line is that all of us are narratively developing all of the time. So I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the developmental tasks of later life. And I don't know that we're looking at these as much as maybe we should in the field of gerontology. You've heard of the 3 R's, which are? Yeah, and why do we always drop the A off of arithmetic? That's so unfair to the word arithmetic. And it's unfair to the word writing too, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I think there's at least 3 R's and maybe 23 R's. I've been playing around with R's, okay? R is the first letter of my last name. So what are some of I think they're mainly narrative tasks because they have to do with making and remaking meaning. Okay? So I put read because that's the title of the talk. Not just telling our stories, but reflecting on them. So a lot of these other words are similar. Review, the whole impulse to life review, which is classic Erik Erikson. To reflect on, to step back. To remember, that's a phrase we get from Barbara Meyerhoff. To reconnect the parts of our lives, okay? To reconcile ourselves to the troubles and the traumas and the difficulties in our story. To resolve past resentments or grudges or regrets. To repair, as in make amends, make peace, forgive ourselves and other people. To reconfigure our identity due to the changes of later life. Another quote from May Sarton. This whole idea of reflecting on and needing and wanting to have time to do that. She was fussing on this in this one particular journal entry. She says, the week has been too full. There has been too much experience and too little time to sort it all out. Too little time between one thing and another. The deeper the experience, the more time is required to sort it out. That kind of captures to me that reading, reflecting, remembering dimension. Just a few more. To regenerate. That may be a task that we have in later life. There's a joke circulating among some psychiatrists which goes like this. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. If you go to enough therapy, you can get that sorted out. It wasn't that bad. Yes, it was horrible, but if I hadn't gone through all that stuff, I wouldn't be where I am today, knowing what I know. Yeah? I'll say more about regenerations. I want to have a quote later on from Harry Berman. To redeem the past. To find the positives and the negatives, if possible. To resign ourselves to the life that we have in fact lived. It is what it had to be, given the circumstances and the conditions and the constraints that I faced growing up in this culture, in this family, or whatever. To recycle, another R. To pass on our life lessons and our wisdom to others so they can benefit from all of that. To rehearse, to prepare for the last chapter. To rejoice, to celebrate our life as all things considered worthwhile. And here's a new word that I'd like to introduce to our thinking. Ruminesce. I think somebody's actually used that. Ruminescence. Yeah? It's reminiscence and rumination combined. And I think it's a wonderful. I wrote a little academic paper years ago called From Computer to Compost. And I was arguing for different ways of thinking about autobiographical memory than this darn sort of computer model, you know. I could get into that later. And to ready ourselves for the narrative challenges of life, later life. What are they? I know I'm throwing a lot at you folks. I apologize, but we're getting to the good stuff. So what's a narrative challenge? A narrative challenge is a challenge to our story, to our storying. If our lives and our stories are inseparable from each other, if who we are is who our stories about ourselves tell other people and ourselves that we are, then our stories themselves can face some unique challenges as we get older. And these are some pictures which don't show up terribly well, I'm sorry, but they are sadly not untypical or atypical pictures of older adults in some institutional settings, not here. Okay? And the looks on the faces, if you could read them, look kind of sad, I'm not sure. You see the far one, though, in the upper left corner? Let me tell you a little story that triggers for me. Pictures can trigger stories. My father was in his 80s. My mother was a little younger. And they decided that, so you can see the woman in that picture sitting in the wheelchair facing the wall of a kind of a long, bleak-looking corridor. Not a happy sight. In his mid-80s, Dad, who was always forward-thinking, said, you know what, Bill, we want you to arrange a tour of one of the large nursing homes here in Fredericton, because we need to plan ahead. We know we can't always live in the apartment where we are now. Can you set that up? No problem. So I called upon my friend Ken McGeorge to arrange a tour of this newly refurbished big nursing home in Fredericton. So Ken McGeorge is walking along ahead of Dad, then Mother, then me, We're walking along like this, and he said, well, here we have this lovely new kitchen area here, and these are the social rooms that we have for our residents, and these are the lovely rooms where our residents can live, and they have their own window and so forth. But as we're walking along, Dad notices this little woman, very tiny, in a wheelchair, quite hunched over like that, sort of like that picture. And he sees she's facing the wall. And I'm thinking that my friend Ken McGeorge, the CEO of the institution, probably wished that she had not been there, because he wanted to sell the idea of Mom and Dad moving to this wonderful facility. Okay, but there she was. But Dad, who had served many rural pastorates throughout New Brunswick, recognized the name on the back of the wheelchair. So here he is. He's got a cane in his 80s. He kind of gets down like this, scrunches around, catches her eye, and says, I see that your name is Mrs. Viola Culloden. Yes, it is. He said, you wouldn't be originally from the Stanley area. Stanley's a community north of Fredericton. Well, yes, I am. Well, you wouldn't know the folks named the Hayes that live next. Yes, they were my neighbors. Okay? It didn't go on very long. It was a short little exchange. But in that short little exchange, I thought, that to me is the essence of what I'm going to talk about later, narrative care, because he recognized her as someone with a name and a hometown and a history and a family and a story. And I like to think that evening, when she was wheeled from her room to the dining hall, she had a better meal, she had a better sleep that night, she had a nicer, more positive exchange with the staff and maybe family members and so forth. Didn't take very long, but to me that's kind of the gist of what I'll be calling narrative care. Okay, it's a whole complex thing in itself. That was triggered for me by that picture there. But what are some of the challenges, though, that we can face to our stories? Here's the middle quotation. This is from Jean Houston, if you keep telling the same sad, small story, you'll keep living the same sad, small life. That's kind of stark. I don't mean to depress us and so forth, but there's a point, perhaps, that she's making here. So what are some of the challenges? One of them is narrative loneliness. Okay? The feeling that there just are very few people left around who know our story, kind of like Mrs. Culloden was probably experiencing. Or care. My father, before he passed away, would get into the routine of calling his cousin Ruth every afternoon at 5:30. Cousin Ruth was 6 years older than Dad. She was 104, he was 96. No, that's whatever. Not good at math. She was, as the saying goes, sharp as a tack. She was still living in the exact same house that she lived in all of her married life, and in the same little settlement where Dad had started out his life as a baby. So they could compare notes like you wouldn't believe about people that Dad would know, nobody else who knew, the persons that lived up the street and so forth. So they could help each other deal with that narrative loneliness that I'm trying to describe here. Narrative loss is very similar. If you have to move from St. John's on the Lake, for example, to another facility where you have just so many things you can take with you, there are fewer things, fewer routines, and fewer people, perhaps, to support your story. Narrative deprivation is when no one asks us anymore. It's been said that the average nursing home resident, probably not in the States, maybe in Canada, receives something like 6 minutes per day of personal contact. I think that has to be extreme, but let's go with that for the second. Even if it's 16 minutes, okay, or 26 minutes. That limited amount of contact per day, after a while, what happens to your sense of your own story, you could argue, you know? Narrative disorientation is another challenge. We get lost in our own story. We talk about people with dementia having lost the thread. I remember having coffee one day, Gary Kenyon and I, with a friend of ours who had recently retired, and we were telling him about our book, Restorying Our Lives. We were quite excited about it. And we were talking about how every life has a story. And he said, story. He said, you can get lost in your own story. I've never forgotten that expression. I thought, wow, there's so much to that, you know. And maybe that's what disorientation can be for some people. Narrative disruption is when a trauma takes place or a tragedy of some sort or a soul injury, as some people refer to it, and it's like your story is torn in two. Narrative disjuncture being a similar sort of situation. In the book Holocaust Testimonies, The Ruins of Memory by Lawrence Langer, he talks about one of the Auschwitz survivors who says that memories of Auschwitz still live inside of her, beside her everyday life and going about her business and so forth. So there's like these two stories that sort of can't come together. Narrative incoherence is when little, if anything, makes sense, and that we think of McAdams' criteria. Narrative debris. I had a colleague named John McIndy who helped start our narrative center. He was tragically murdered in 2008, just after we got the funding for our narrative center. He had spent a lot of his research time interviewing men in prison in New Brunswick, maximum security prisons. And his sense, interviewing a number of these men in the very restrictive narrative environment of a prison community, it was like they couldn't string a story about their life together. All they had were bits and pieces, which he called narrative debris. I'm sure we've all been in situations where that's all we had, okay? And here's a quote from Canada's own Margaret Atwood. Anybody here a Margaret Atwood fan? Oh, good. Super. So she says in her book, Alias Grace, when you're in the middle of a story, it isn't a story at all, but only a confusion, a dark roaring, a blindness, a wreckage of shattered glass and splintered wood like a house in a whirlwind. It's only afterwards that it becomes anything like a story at all, when you're telling it to yourself or to someone else. Narrative dispossession, I want to say a little bit about that. My colleague Clive Baldwin at CERN, brilliant guy, done a lot of work in narrative and dementia, and he's coined the phrase narrative dispossession, that we sometimes unwittingly and with the best of intentions dispossess people with dementia of their life, their identity, and their story because we assume there's not really a story there if they can't tell it in a way that makes sense to the rest of us. Okay? I think it's common for us to stereotype people. This is what discrimination amounts to. We stereotype other people whom we don't even know. I looked at those people that I was getting on the plane with yesterday, and until I sat beside them and got a little bit of their story, I was, oh, I know what he's all about. I stereotyped that person, okay? That happens often when we're in the airports, and so on and so forth. Narrative knots is a phrase that a PhD student I met at Emory University a few years ago. She was a narrative therapist from Japan. And she said, with many of my clients, she said, it's like they have these narrative knots. And it's my task to help them untangle those knots, okay? And sort out the threads so that they can move on. Narrative dissolution is another one. I have this fear when I look at my students in their 20s and they're addicted to these screens that maybe we're losing, this is a radical thing to say and probably stupid, but we're losing perhaps the capacity to string a story together. You know, and this opens up another whole conversation which we could have and so forth, but the loss potentially of the capacity to tell a story about our life or a story period and to have a conversation and perhaps a relationship, that seems to me to be in question marks these days on some level. Narrative foreclosure, Mark Freeman's phrase, and he defines it as the premature conviction that our story is effectively over, that no new chapters or themes will open up. Okay? No adventures, no new characters will enter in ours, no new episodes, and so we live in epilogue time. Lawrence McCullough, I think, uses that phrase. I go to the Tim Hortons coffee shop. Anybody know what Tim Hortons? And you can predict it. I read about this in one of my books there, Tales from the Coffee Shop. Older adults come in groups. The women sit over here, the men sit over there. And sometimes I'm curious about what goes on in the conversations among the men, because it seems like some of them are in what I would call narrative foreclosure. They're retired. They're not doing the sorts of things that brought them a sense of identity and purpose like they used to do. They can't do the things that they used to do for pleasure and so forth, so they're kind of stalled. Okay? And there are gender differences which I glossed over before in the ways in which we story our lives. The work of Robin Fivish down at Emory suggests that little girls tend to become more narratively complex and tell more emotionally nuanced and detailed, narratively rich stories about their little lives starting from a very young age, whereas little boys are more apt to be coached to stick to the facts. So if you have a life of sticking to the facts, false facts, whatever, then maybe there is a tendency, maybe men are more susceptible to narrative foreclosure, if it's even a thing, than women are. Opens up another whole topic. Here is the situation that some people are maybe in. What do you want to say to this guy? Let it go. Drop it. Drop it. I like to use that as an example. Maybe he's holding on to a story about something that somebody did to him back then, or something that he can't get past, or some woman who did him wrong, or whatever it might be. And the story is dominating his life. It's imprisoning him. Okay? How many of you work in a medical setting? Okay, a few in a medical setting. So I put this slide in here to medicalize some of these narrative challenges. Okay? So one of them might be, because if we work in hospital or healthcare settings from a humanistic or narrative perspective, we might not be taken seriously. Right? So if we can provide some terminology that sounds more official, then maybe we'll be taken seriously. Like, for example, narrative arrest. That's an acute case of narrative foreclosure. All right? Narrative atrophy. If that 6 minutes per day thing is true, then what happens? Your story dries up inside of you. Right? Narrative anemia. Story is kind of thin and weak, not terribly thick and strong. Narrative septicemia. A nursing friend of mine recently shared this possibility. Narrative septicemia is when your story is littered with contaminated sequences, which Dan McAdams would say, or toxic stories or problem-saturated stories. Okay? Narrative indigestion, like May Sarton. You've got experiences, stuff you're going through, but you don't have time to digest them and sort them out. Narrative constipation is when you can't get an untold story out. Worst case scenario is narrative compaction. You got to really dig to get the story out. Narrative diarrhea, story is flowing, but there's not very much substance to it. And narrative pregnancy. There's a new story ready to be born. It just needs to be listened into existence. Narrative challenges, they can be exacerbated, of course, by the physical losses of later life. I think they're recipes for depression in some cases. I'll say more about these later if I have time. And they are intensified by the changing and narrowing of our narrative environments due to, for example, institutionalization. Can you think of a client or a parishioner or a relative or a roommate or a friend or a family member who maybe, in your view, now that you have this terminology to play around with, was or is dealing with certain narrative challenges? Narrative loneliness, narrative loss, narrative foreclosure. Think about that. Chat about that over lunch if you want to. Okay? I want to say a bit. I have, I think, until another 10 minutes or so. Thank you. I want to talk about narrative environment, because then once we've done this, then we're home free for the rest of the hour or so this afternoon. Narrative environment is a term that I am grateful to Jerome Bruner for coining that phrase, that term. I think no one is a narrative island, okay? We don't story our lives in a vacuum, but always within an intricate web of relationships and contexts and larger stories that we're forever moving in and out of. For example, the family story that you were born into, okay? It had its own sort of plot lines going, its own themes already sort of underway, and you get entered into that story as a character, all right, for better, for worse. And that family has a kind of a narrative environment, by which I mean there's a kind of a quality of talking and listening that characterizes that environment, a certain code, implicit or explicit, for telling and talking and listening, who gets more airtime, who doesn't, what topics can be talked about and in what ways and not, which topics are. Their narrative environment just seemed to me to be much more open, fluid, relaxed and so forth, and you go back to the the Randall family. We could all think about the narrative environments that we were shaped in, which of course are continually changing and so forth. Narrative environments can be not just families, but couples, friendships that we have, institutions that we live in, companies that we work for, cultures that we live in. I had a chance last summer to travel to Norway, and a 6-day road trip. That was a lot of fun. And I realized when I got talking to some of the Norwegian people that they would say things like, well, you know, we have a saying in Norway. And they would trot out a particular saying that means a lot to Norwegian people, not so much to me, but I could see the wisdom in it. And I realized that every culture has its sayings. Obviously, different cultures have different languages, but different sayings, different sort of themes and metaphors that float through the air. So we can think of narrative environments in terms of broad cultures as well as particular institutions. But they can be, oh dear, I apologize. Narrative environments can be positive or negative. They can be open or closed. They can be thick or bleak. They can be inviting or inhibiting of our narrative development. They can be coercing or co-authoring. They can be restorying or de-storying, if you catch that sort of pun. If you're entering a hospital or a nursing home, it's certainly going to be a change in narrative environment, and will be to some degree a restorying experience for you, depending upon the diagnosis and the duration of your stay. It will present us with significant narrative challenges and will require revising the plot, whether a little or a lot. At best, it's going to be just one short chapter in our overall story. Other chapters will follow. It's not the whole story, and it's not the end of the story. But at worst, it's a de-storying experience. Our identity is reduced to a set of symptoms or a diagnosis or a label. We're referred to by others that are at the nurse's station as the gallbladder in 13B, the feed in 102, or I don't know if you have this term here in Wisconsin, the bed blocker. We have a crisis in the healthcare system in where I live, and we have a lot of older people who need immediate care, but there's no place for them to go to rehabilitate after they've had their care. So they're in the hallways and in the aisleways, and they're being referred to in the news even as bed blockers. You know. So, obviously, hospitals and healthcare settings are busy places, but do you have signs like this in doctors' offices here in Milwaukee? Yeah, well, this is my doctor. I love him. He's a great guy. But he felt obliged, because he has so many patients on any given day, to put a sign like this up there. And somebody said to me, well, the doctor I go to, they have only one problem per patient. And I'm not blaming anybody. You know, these are busy people. But the narrative environments of such settings don't invite the storied side of who we are. Okay? Thankfully, we have narrative medicine. I say thankfully because I think it's a hopeful sign that in the field of medicine and medical training, we have a greater appreciation for the stories of our patients' lives. And I refer to Rita Sharon. Some of you may have known of her work. Narrative medicine, honoring the stories of illness, okay? And she's a PhD in English literature, but also a medical doctor. Originally from Montreal, Canada, I believe. But she says, patient-centered care seeks an understanding, an integrated understanding of the patient's world. I want you to hang on to that because I think that's an important topic. Because for me, the patient's world is their unique story world. Their stories are central to their identities and their emotions and their values and their beliefs and their physical and mental health. And so perhaps caring for patients' stories is as important as caring for their bodies. Maybe we can sense their stories in their postures, in their gestures, because, of course, our stories are embodied. So a question for us, and I'll leave on this note, how can settings such as these, healthcare settings, not this setting here, but hospitals, nursing homes, etc., how can they be more restorying and not destorying? How can we help patients, residents, etc., meet the many challenges to their narratives and experience a measure of what's been called narrative repair? And my short answer for that is this, what some of us are calling narrative care, which is the hands-on, more practical dimension of the whole narrative perspective I've been talking about this morning. And these quotes will leave you with something to ponder as you go off to lunch. This is from Maya Angelou. And she says, this was, I believe, this may have been in an interview that she gave. She says, there's no agony like bearing an untold story inside of you. I'm sure we've all felt this at some point. How do I even tell this story? Okay? Where do I even begin? Arthur Kleinman, another narrative medicine person, he says, few of the tragedies at life's end are as heartrending to the physician or the clinician as that of the frail patient who has no one to tell their life story to. And then you can't tell who you are unless someone's listening. Here's what narrative care is not, and you can think about that as you go off to lunch. Can you see this picture? Probably not. We have, looks like grandmother in the corner, looking around, trying to make eye contact with the other people. The other people, the children and the grandchildren, what are they doing? That's what narrative care is not. All right? So, have a great time over lunch conversation. And you might be thinking, when was the time that you felt listened to really, really well? Because listening is the core of what we'll be talking about after the break.
We do have time for some questions if you want to take some.
Sure.
All right. Does anybody have any? I'm going to turn the lights up really quick, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you for that presentation. One of the things that's in our evaluation form, a question is, describe how this session can be applied to daily life and work. And earlier on, when you were talking, I was starting to get the impression that this was depending on people being able to have a time and a place in their life to actually write out their stories. But a lot of people don't have that time and place. So for people who don't, like, how could you talk a little bit about how this applies to the average person who's maybe not a literary person or a word-oriented person?
Yeah, that's a great question. Did everybody hear that question okay? Yeah. The question, well, I'll put it in my own words. This sounds great, but it seems to imply that or it seems to be sort of focused on people who have the skills and the ability and so forth to write or to put their stories together in some sort of written or literary form, but what about other ways of exploring or telling our stories? That's probably not a good recap. And that's an excellent question, and I do apologize if it does seem overly writing-oriented, but as I hope we'll see in the second part of the day, story listening and storytelling doesn't have to be written out kind of stories. I think there's lots of opportunities for us to provide narrative care to people who have no interest in writing, writing a memoir per se. I mean, that's a specialized kind of activity. It takes a lot of time and energy and so forth. But that doesn't mean that there still aren't lots of opportunities for us to invite a narrative activity that can be the beginning for some tackling of the narrative challenges that people might be experiencing. And some articulating of their own unique truth and so forth. But again, words are not the only way. I mean, this is the talk that was given yesterday, I'm sure touched upon this, is that the arts and creative activities, which provide us with opportunities to express and to explore the stuff of our lives in other media, absolutely essential. I don't have expertise in that area, but we will touch on that a little bit in the second half.
Other questions?
I have a question. Why were you sent upstairs when you were at the table with your family? What did you say? My God, it must have been terrible. I hate these things where they're just left hanging, and then I'm going to spend the night wondering what the hell did he do.
I really can't. I'm going to have to plead the fifth on that. Sorry. I didn't know what it meant, but...
I'd like to know what this has to do with the nature of identity, in as much that I thought that when we got older and wiser and not young and clueless, as you put in one of your quotes, that our identities would become stronger. But listening to all these things that happen, it seems that so much is taken away from people. Do their identities become lessened?
I think that they can. And I'm just trying to draw some attention here in what I was saying this morning to the possibility of our identity formation and development and strengthening being significantly challenged from many different on many different fronts with changes and the transitions and the losses that can come with later life. But and maybe I'm making too much of that. I accept that. I'm thinking here of my colleagues in places like the Netherlands, where they've been doing some helpful work with older adults who experience depression. And when they are taken through a structured process of life review and reminiscence, and their stories are looked at and articulated from a number of different angles, and in that sense kind of strengthened and kind of brought out, they experience in measurable ways, and I'm not a measuring kind of researcher, a decrease in their depressive symptoms, both at the time and even 6 months later, and they demonstrated increase in meaning and purpose and overall well-being, and that suggests to me that there is a link, perhaps, in later life for some, perhaps many, I don't know. There can be a link between the emotional issues that we're wrestling with and the identity, the assaults on our identity that we're experiencing by virtue of the aging process itself, and living in a day and age when aging is not viewed as a positive thing, often, sadly.
I just wanted to comment back to the gentleman that was looking for different ways. We have experienced that here at St. John. 8 years ago, this whole building was empty and in a month full of people that never knew each other before. And the table you sat at this morning, the round table, came into existence to allow people to express a narrative that they wouldn't have had a chance otherwise. And I pass it on. If you have some person you can trust, you can meet for coffee and share. And that's a way of taking care of your narrative.
I thank you very much for that, Art. And I had a taste of the very warm, inviting, welcoming narrative environment of this whole place by sitting with you and the others today for breakfast. So I get a good feeling when I come into the walls of this place. I haven't been here for very long, but I get a really good feeling about the quality and the intentionality with which you've shaped and nurtured a narrative environment that is inviting of people's stories and lives and truth, etc. Yeah.
One more question.
I hate to do this to you as a preacher's kid, but to me so much of life is wasted on contemplation of whether or not there's an afterlife. When the answer is simple. All we have to do is live our lives well so that we are fondly remembered. And the afterlife will take care of itself.
I hope you had a good lunch. I did, and I got a chance to get caught up with a number of people, particularly my colleague Karen Scarrett, whom, as I mentioned before, a little bit of a shout out for you, Karen, has done some very interesting work in, among other areas, couples therapy, and using we stories to nurture resilience among couples. And that triggered me to just make one comment from the earlier part of my presentation, where I was jumping over some slides in the interest of time. I had a little bit more to say on the topic of narrative environment, or what I'm calling narrative environment. How, for example, in families, we are intimately entwined with one another's stories, such that where my story begins and my sister's story ends is almost impossible to say. I really can't tell my story about my life without telling a bit about my sister's stories and my parents' stories, and the same with them. And as far as being in friendships are concerned, friendships are also narrative environments. Where my friend's story stops and my story begins is impossible to say at some point. And then it gets further complicated because I have my story of my friend's story of me, and my friend has his or her story of my story of her or him. And so it goes. But so just to have that in mind, and the idea of co-authoring, which is an interesting concept to play around with as we move into talking more now about narrative environment. And I hope as we move now to talk about narrative care, which is the last section of what I prepared for you today. So I hope we have more time and space in our afternoon to have some Q&A and some discussion and so forth. And I might even break you up into small groups for a little bit, if that doesn't scare the heck out of you. But and how much time do we have, Jan?
Hour and a half, 90 minutes.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying, an hour and a half or 90 minutes. So.
You take your choice.
All right. Good. You say potato, I say potato. So when I talk about narrative care, I'm not talking about something that's a definite thing. It's a phrase that some of us have been playing around with in the recent years to cover a lot of ways in which we interact with one another in, say, caring or health caring settings. And I'm going to say a bit more about the range, if you will, of narrative care. If you want to explore that further, there is a book that I think might be out there on your book display that was edited by my colleague Gary Kenyon, one of our Dutch colleagues, Ernst Bolmeyer, and myself, called Storying Later Life: Issues, Investigations, and Interventions in Narrative Gerontology. So it's a term that we began to use, and we found that other people have been picking up on it, for better or for worse. And we had a special issue of something called the Journal of Aging Studies, which is edited by J. Berg Gubrium, section of a publication of that journal in 2015 was devoted to narrative care, where my colleague Clive Baldwin, whom I mentioned, has written a very helpful article on narrative ethics for narrative care. And we've written some more about our resilience project. But anyway, narrative care is a term that I use kind of synonymously with a word we don't perhaps use that often. It's story listening. Story listening. Nobody, to my knowledge, has sort of undertaken to sort of precisely define what narrative care is, and that sort of task is beyond me. I just kind of like to throw out ideas, and because they work for me for a while, and then move on to some other ones. But narrative care is story listening. We have a lot of talk shows in the media, but maybe not a lot of listen shows. That's kind of a stupid thing to say, but you know what I'm trying to get across here. So narrative care or story listening, by that I mean attending to, and as importantly, for the stories by which people understand who they are. Again, there's this link that I'm proposing, perhaps incorrectly, that our identities and our stories are intricately entwined. And this is narrative psychology 101, but it needs to be kind of kept in the fronts of our minds, that our stories are not just stuff that we can rattle off. They're somehow integral to who we are and the way we are in the world. So what I'm saying about narrative care is that it's about attitude as much as it is activity. I work quite a bit with those who interact with older adults in various healthcare settings. And I like to say that whether you're a personal support worker, a registered nurse, someone who's doing cleaning or whatever, there's opportunities for you to practice narrative care, even just in the attitude that you bring to the persons you're working with. Just realizing, as my dad did with Mrs. Cullen, that person has a story. Wasn't there the motto for the program A&E Biography years ago, they don't even have that program anymore, as far as I know. Every life has a story. I mean, it's not rocket science to say that, but it just, to me, conveys so much. So narrative care is about attitude as much as activity. I like to stress it is about quality of connection as much as it is about quantity of time. I hear people in healthcare settings say, well, I know I should practice narrative care, but it's just one more thing I have to add to my list. And I like to say, well, it's not quite, it's about the way in which you're connecting with the persons you're interacting with. I like to say it's about fostering a narrative environment that is potentially a wisdom environment. Some of us have written in other places about this concept of a wisdom environment. And I think an event like this has the potential, particularly when you're chatting with each other over coffee and so forth, to be a wisdom environment where you call forth the best stories, so to speak, from one another. And there's learning and discovery that takes place. So narrative care is also about helping people tell what I call thicker, stronger, richer stories about their lives. Not just write them, because that's only one way of telling a story, but articulating. And sometimes when we're working with people who have, shall we say, a lot of narrative debris, and we're in a counseling role, it behooves us to sort of, if you will, fan the flames of the little embers of story that are there, and that perhaps if they were fanned and nurtured enough could start to take the form of a more full-on story that the person can then draw sustenance from. So narrative care can be labor-intensive, or it can be quick and dirty. When I say labor-intensive, there's a particular form of narrative care that some colleagues of ours in Fredericton, actually students, former students, have implemented at the same large nursing home where my dad was on tour. And it's called the Narrative Care Program, duh. But here's how it works. Individual residents in the nursing home are selected to have their stories listened to through a life story interview process with a family member, perhaps, or a staff member, or a student, or in some cases, someone who is just a volunteer working at the nursing home. And through using a system that's been developed by Beth Sanders called Life Bio, this is one of a number of programs, if you will, that can be used. You have a number of questions that you can ask the older adult about his or her life, starting from childhood, working their way up through education, schooling, growing up, career, family, and so on and so forth. So maybe it might take 4 or 5 interviews to collect the story of that individual's life. Then that's put together as a book with a hardcover to it, and that book is presented to the resident at a special ceremony called Celebrating Our Stories. And these ceremonies can be attended by as many as 100 people. I've seen the lieutenant governor of our province, who's a First Nations native indigenous person, and who said, I'm so pleased that your care center is doing this program, because in our tradition, in our culture, the elders have the wisdom and have the stories, and we respect them for that. And in addition to the resident being presented with this book of their life, there's a 15 to 20 minute video that is prepared. And the video contains pictures from the individual resident's life, from their childhood right up till the present. It contains pieces of music that they have enjoyed over the years. Could be anything from Merle Haggard to Montavani to Gustav Mahler to Miles Davis. Just pick one or a number of them. And then as well, some of the sayings that the person actually voiced in the interviews themselves. So that's put together as a very moving. I wish I had brought one with me. It's the sort of thing, this doesn't sound a bit weird, it's the sort of thing that sometimes will be played at people's funerals after the fact, so to speak. So this is played for the resident before the fact, before they pass on. And I can tell you very honestly that the effect on the audience, the resident, him or herself, the fellow residents who are there, family members, people like myself, students, whoever comes, is that there's seldom a dry eye in the crowd. It's like this 15 to 20 minute video doesn't tell the whole life. It's only a little metaphor for the whole life. It's only a parable, if you will, of the whole life. But it nonetheless gets across to all who are present that this person has had, continues to have a real full-on life. And what happens is that that quality of connection that the staff members go on to have with those residents changes. And in that book I mentioned, Storying Later Life, Daphne Noonan, one of our proud narrative gerontology student graduates, writes about the ripple effect that this ceremony has. This, they call it celebrating our stories. It changes the culture of the institution in terms of the interactions between residents and staff, between residents and other residents, between residents and family members, between staff and staff, etc. And so the story goes. So that's a bit of idea. But I call that the Cadillac version of narrative care. But it can also be just practiced in between the lines of other activities. If you're, for example, in a nursing home and you're wheeling somebody to their meal, there's an opportunity to engage in some narrative conversation. And in that sense, tackle some of those narrative challenges that I was going on about before the break. It can be adapted to different contexts. I'm speaking here of healthcare context, from the emergency room, I suppose, to long-term care, to pastoral care. And I'm going to tell you a little bit later on about a wonderful book that I am very honored to have made some contribution to by Karen Scheib, who's a professor of pastoral theology at Emory University, Candler School of Theology. And she talks about pastoral care as being story companions. When you're in a pastoral role and you offer your services as a story companion to people in your congregation. Narrative care has been talked about and written about in relation to persons who have psychiatric disorders. I can direct you here to the work of Phil Thomas. Every year at our Narrative Center we have a speaker from away who comes from, in this case, the UK. Philip Thomas has written about using narrative strategies adopted from narrative therapy to work with people with psychoses of one sort or another, schizophrenia and so forth, as does Sue Ellen Hampkins. And I think narrative care, as I'm calling it, can be tailored to and has implications for working with people who have depression, dementia, and those who are dying. So this is a guy named John MacLeod from the UK who's written a book called Narrative and Psychotherapy, and I like what he says in the introduction. He kind of gives an overview of the psychotherapeutic field, including narrative therapy per se, but other modes of therapy. And he says, all therapies are narrative therapies. Whatever you're doing or think you're doing as a therapist or client can be understood in terms of telling and retelling stories. The importance of listening to stories, rather than just employing listening skills in general, is that the story represents the basic means by which people organize and communicate the meaning of events and experiences. I kind of like that. He agrees with what I've been thinking, so that's why I like it. He probably goes on to say lots of other things that I don't like, therefore I don't quote them. Okay? That's how we work in the field of academics, or at least I do. But I think on a very practical level, if you think of stop, look, and listen, right? Do you have that on your railway crossings here in Wisconsin? We used to have them, but now we have the bilingual version, which kind of loses something. There's a lot of print to put on those crosswalk things. Things to look for in practicing narrative care. Let's say that you are entering a residence room, perhaps for the first time, or a patient's room, as for a healthcare context. For the first time, what do you look for in terms of practicing narrative care? Well, you look for what books or papers or magazines, if any, are they reading, or do they have lying about? Okay, is it the rise and fall of the Third Reich, or is it People magazine, or stuff in between? Is it the Bible? Okay, what TV channels or shows or movies do they like watching? When I arrived last night at the wonderful guest room that I'm staying in here in this facility, I turned on the TV, as one is wont to do after a crazy day of traveling. So what's the first thing that comes on? I think it's monster trucks. Then I kind of lost some interest in that at a certain point and moved on to some other things. And finally I said, I'll just turn it off and read a book and go to sleep. But what sorts of programs or movies or shows are the persons you're meeting perhaps for the first time? What are they watching or paying attention to? What music do they like listening to? I come from Eastern Canada, and lots of older adults like the old-time fiddle music. Don Messer and his Jubilee. These are names that won't mean anything to you, I'm sure. Or Ned Landry, or Merle Haggard, or Johnny Cash, or Tammy Wynette, etc. Or perhaps other types of music. What pictures or mementos are around them? Are there lots of pictures of family and so forth, or maybe just one or two? Who visits them? If anybody does, and what do they talk about? That's kind of getting into the listening thing. What information is on their chart, insofar as you're privy to it, regarding their jobs, their careers, their hobbies, their affiliations, their family situation, their marital status, etc. And then in the last line here, what stories or storying styles or story worlds are suggested by their postures, by their gestures, by their eyes, by their sighs. So when we switch now to things that we listen for, stop, look, and listen, I want to tell you a little story about a teacher of mine named June Donovan. She was my grade 11 English teacher in Harvey Regional High School, about 25 in my graduating class. And she was a good teacher as far as I was concerned, but she wasn't very good at controlling the class environment, okay? Sometimes happens. But she made a big impression on me, and she gave me encouraging comments, some of my little essays and so forth. As fate would have it, years later, she showed up in one of my classes. I was teaching part-time at the University of New Brunswick in the education faculty, teaching a course on narrative knowing and learning for the Masters of Education program. And she was at that point doing her master's degree in education, having put in a pretty long career as a teacher. So what we decided to do as a classroom exercise was we broke up into pairs, or twos and threes, dyads or triads, or whatever you call them. Okay, and we had a kind of a protocol that I designed of questions that we could ask one another to do life story interviews with each other. So it fell to me to interview my own teacher, June. And what struck me in a poignant, almost sad kind of way, was a particular phrase that she used repeatedly in talking out her story as part of the exercise we were doing in this course on narrative knowing and learning. And the phrase that she used was, "Somehow I managed to." And she would say with a sigh, "Somehow I managed to survive the divorce, and somehow I managed to raise the 3 kids on my own, and somehow I managed to survive cancer, and somehow I managed to get into this master's program." We were all stunned at all the things she was accomplishing and had accomplished, but we were also intrigued by this particular phrase, "Somehow I managed to," and the sigh with which she said it. So this is the kind of thing I'm suggesting we listen for, and this is not news to anybody who is a therapist and practices therapy as a profession. So we're listening for not just for the facts, ma'am, but for the feelings. We're listening into the story. This is a phrase I get from Eugene Kennedy, a Roman Catholic priest counselor who's written a book called On Becoming a Counselor, I think. Anyway, he talks about listening for the story, but listening into the story. There's a bit of scholarship behind the scenes here, a book called Narrative Truth and Historical Truth by the psychoanalyst Donald Spence. Some of you may be familiar with his work. So what else are we listening? We're listening to those telltale expressions, like "somehow I managed to," or one particular woman I can remember chatting with when I was a minister in Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan. Gravelbourg is actually not the way you should pronounce it. You should pronounce it Gravelbourg, okay? Comme les Français. But the English people say Gravelbourg, okay? It was a beautiful little town in the middle of the flat prairie, had a beautiful cathedral there, and so forth. And Annie Cusick was one of my parishioners, but she developed dementia. And I would go to visit her in the nursing home, and she would greet me at the front door as I walked into the nursing home. She'd be the first person you'd see there, and with a big smile on her face. She didn't know who I was, But she'd say, ah, life's quite a journey, isn't it? And okay, and she would keep repeating that phrase. Life's quite a journey. So even in the midst of her dementia, there was a phrase, there was a metaphor that conveyed quite a bit to me about her story world and her life. Recurring themes or metaphors, key plot lines or conflicts or episodes. The reminiscence type that the person engages in. Are you familiar with the work of people like Jeffrey Webster and Paul Wong and Watt? I can't remember the first name. Wong and Watt wrote an interesting article back in the early 90s where they laid out basic reminiscence styles or reminiscence types that they identified older people as tending to use. There's a range of them, 6, okay? They include obsessive reminiscence, where you reminisce obsessively about a particular event or a particular part in your life, and you can't sort of get past that. There's escapist reminiscence, where you reminisce about the good old days, when a dime was worth a dime, and a man's word was a man's word, and today it's all gone to hell in a handcart sort of thing by comparison. Then there's transmissive reminiscence, where you're reminiscing in order to pass on your wisdom and your knowledge to other people, perhaps younger people. Then there's also instrumental reminiscence, which is not memories for playing the guitar, but reminiscing so that you can use the experiences you've had in the past to help you make sense of a challenge or a problem you might have in the present. So you're using your reminiscences in an instrumental way to help you navigate the present circumstance. And then lastly, kind of the creme de la creme is integrative reminiscence, which is considered to be the most adaptive. That's where we're reminiscing with the purpose in mind to pull ourselves together. We talked more about that this morning. So when you're listening to somebody, what kind of reminiscence am I hearing? Okay. Are there certain signature stories that this person is coming out with, meeting me perhaps for the first time? Are there certain turning point stories or nostalgic stories? I use that phrase deliberately because it's a phrase coined by one of our narrative gerontology colleagues in Norway, Oddgeir Sinus. And I had a visit with him and his partner earlier last year, on the beginning of my Norwegian road trip. But he wrote a wonderful little article in that special issue of the Journal of Aging Studies where he says nostalgic stories are really important for persons who can be really important for persons who are dying, because he does a lot of his research interviewing, talking with, doing life story conversations with palliative patients. Okay, and he noticed a trend. He noticed that a number of the palliative patients or persons had a preference not so much for doing the big story narrative reflection on their life as a whole, but rather on telling sort of sweet, poignant, nostalgic stories about, not in an obsessive or escapist way, but, when I was a little girl, sorry, that doesn't maybe, I remember, lying in the fields there overlooking the fjord, and the wind was blowing nice in the breeze, and the flowers back and forth, and it makes me feel so good to remember that, And he makes the point that remembering those sweet, not particularly substantive, but sweet stories help nonetheless to help that person buttress or sustain or remind themselves of aspects of their identity and of their life that are really near and dear to them. Shadow stories. Our colleague in narrative gerontology, Kate de Medeiros, has written in that same special issue a wonderful article about shadow stories. And she talks about how in her interviews with older adults, she discerned that there were certain stories that were in the shadows. In other words, she would have an interview participant say, I was married there 3 times, and then we moved out to Calgary, and wait a minute, married 3 times? But they don't themselves elaborate upon that, okay? But you have a sense there's a whole story or 2 or 3 or 4 there, and maybe after the interview is over or towards the end, you might say, you said earlier something about do you want to say more about that? Nope. But it's in the shadows, if you know what I'm saying, okay? Counter stories. Stories or you get a sense of, they're telling me these stories about who they are, but I sense there's another sort of counter story going on, almost like it was an undercurrent in a river. We have the St. John River in New Brunswick, and I learned, much to my great delight many years ago, that not far from the Mactaquac Dam, which holds back much of the river and prevents it from flooding the rest of the province, there is apparently an underground river that goes in the opposite direction. Geologists have discerned that, hydrologists or whatever. And I thought, ooh, wow, what's going on there? What flows in that underground river going in another direction? How do the individuals characterize themselves and others in the bits that they share with you? Okay, with my teacher June, it's like my reading would be that she was portraying herself as kind of a tragic hero, almost a victim, but yet she had accomplished things that she was quite proud of, but didn't feel so proud of them that she wanted to say, I managed to get this. Okay, somehow I managed to. So how are they characterizing themselves in the midst of what they're saying? And what degree of narrative agency is coming forward? I told you about the research project that we've had going at St. Thomas University, where we've interviewed older adults about their lives and then compared how they story their lives in the interview to how they score on measures of resilience. And we have found this trend that the people who score highest on resilience often have had the hardest, toughest lives, but they also have a strong degree of narrative agency. I've got a story to tell. I've had an interesting life. I've had all kinds of ups and downs, but I wouldn't trade my life for anything. Okay, and I would write that book and it would be a trilogy plus. What are the larger narratives that they're rooted in or that they allude to? One of the patterns that we found with some of the people who scored high in resilience but tended to tell kind of thin stories is that nonetheless they told stories about the church that they were part of and that was very important in their life, or about the family that they were always sort of interacting with and so forth. Or maybe in some cases they had a larger story, a cause that they were really, really committed to. So they kind of played down the importance of their own individual story, but there was this larger story from which they were deriving a great and a healthy deal of their, shall we say, narrative identity. Are there incipient restoryings or sacred stories that are waiting to be told? I'll say more about that in a little bit here. The concept of sacred tale or sacred story. What can we do? Things that we can do to stimulate narrative activity. Well, there's a whole bunch, actually. A whole bunch of things, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. We are, at our university, embarking on a program for which we've received some funding from the government to launch a Train the Trainer program in narrative care with older adults. The idea is that we'll train people to then go out and train other people to exercise and practice narrative care with older adults in various settings and so forth. And one of the strategies that probably will enter into that Train the Trainer program is what I call one visit, one question. It's really pretty simple stuff. And you could have a box of questions at the nurse's station, and we're talking about an institutional setup here. And every time you go into a resident's room to do some particular task, you pull a question out of the box. The questions are kind of fairly innocuous, but kind of open-ended, like, do you remember a favorite pet that you had in your life? Okay? What's a favorite piece of music that you've enjoyed? What's something that you used to do with your grandparents? Okay, just sort of simple conversation starters. But the conversations that get started can often open out into healing kinds of experiences for both parties concerned. One word exercise, again, the apple, bike, cat thing I told you, the ABCs. I mean, that's deceptively simple. It starts all kinds of narrative activity. Window boxes, and I don't know about St. John's on the Lake, but I know a lot of other institutions have boxes outside of the rooms of those living there, and in the boxes are memorabilia, perhaps medals, pictures, photos, whatever, that are significant for and tell you something about the story of that person's life. But speaking of doors, do you know about this? I'm going to see if I can call this up. I'm kind of proud of myself that I figured out how to put hyperlinks into PowerPoint. I hope, fingers crossed, that it will work. I mentioned Daphne Noonan, who wrote the chapter about the ripple effect, the impact of this narrative care program on the institution where she was working. She's now the CEO of a small rural nursing home in Stanley, the same village where Mrs. Culloden came from, don't you know? And she and her colleagues have bought into a particular innovation that comes from the Netherlands called true doors. How many of you have heard of the true doors? Oh, 2 of you back there? Let me see if I can call this up.
In just under an hour, Kevin Young and Andy McFarland create a personalized door. The one next to them is fake, too. McFarland wasn't sold on the True Doors photographic decals until he saw the residents' reaction.
It was quite emotional. There was probably 4 or 5 of them around crying afterwards because it reminded them of the past, I guess.
You could almost swear you could push a few letters through the slot. Created by a Dutch art student who wanted her apartment door to have some character, the idea was picked up by nursing homes in Holland. Turned out it helped those with dementia locate their own rooms, and more.
It's essentially a door that helps us to tell the story of a resident's life, or just to help us get to know a little bit more about the residents through their choices. So it's neat.
Residents can have a photo taken of a door from their past, or select one from a catalog. Greta Spillman decided on multiple images that evoke powerful memories for her.
The waterfalls, went on our honeymoon. Our daughters, they see rainbows when they're traveling back and forth to Fredericton. My husband and their father is still looking after us.
Jean Reardon Cormier has the door of the Woodland Church.
And my daughter got married there. So when she heard about the name, heard about the doors, she says, Mom, let's pick the door of the church.
Pamela Spillman brought the idea to her boss, Daphne Noonan. Since then, 24 doors have been chosen. Spillman says this was the first one, Lloyd Branscom's room.
Lloyd came down and grabbed me, and he's like, you know, he couldn't talk, but he wanted me to come out. And when I seen it, it's like, I mean, he was all tears in his eyes. Like, he was just so happy to see it. And even now, he brings everybody around to see that door.
Each decal costs between $130 to $170. Nashwauk Villa is now the second care home in the country to use the True Door model. Catherine Harrop, CBC News, Stanley.
All right. So you have heard of that particular innovation. It's quite ingenious in a way. And again, it can be very helpful for persons who are having some memory issues and so forth. The iPod project, or music and memory. How many of you have heard of this innovation? So that's great. There's some hands, but I think I'll show this little video anyway because it's very powerful. And it's called Alive Inside. It's a 6-minute clip of a longer production that has been made. And you'll see 2 people in there. One is Dan Cohen, who's the social worker from New York City, I believe, who is the mastermind of this idea called the iPod Project. And you also see and hear Oliver Sacks. Are you familiar with the work of Oliver Sacks? His books like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, that sort of thing. So we're going to play a little bit of a clip of that, if I may be so kind.
I have one resident that barely opened her eyes. She didn't respond. As much as I tried, I knew her for 2 years. No matter what I tried, massage wouldn't work, nothing worked. But when we got introduced to the iPods and the family told me the things that she liked, it was amazing once we put the iPod on her. She started shaking her feet. She started moving her head. Her son was just amazed. Okay, can we stop? Because now I'm getting all I'm seeing her all over again.
Hi, Papa. Hi, Papa.
Huh?
How you doing?
I'm all right. I'm fine. Wait.
Who am I?
I don't know. Wait a minute. I don't know.
Okay, it's Cherry.
How long has he been in the nursing home? Approximately 10 years. He was having seizures, and my mother couldn't handle him at home. Of course, it affected me greatly because he was always, fun-loving, singing, every occasion he would come out with a song, no matter where he was. I remember as a child, he used to walk us down the street, me and my brother, and he would stop and do Singing in the Rain. He would have us jumping and swinging around poles. He was, he was good. He was always into music, always loved singing, dancing.
His name is Henry Dreyer.
Uh-huh.
And I'm looking more or less for religious music for him.
Okay.
Because he enjoys music and he always quoting the Bible. So I'd rather have that for him.
We first see Henry inert, maybe depressed, unresponsive, and almost unalive.
Henry.
Yeah.
Henry.
Yes, sir.
I found your music. You want your music now?
What's up to you?
Okay, let's try your music, okay? And then you tell me if it's too loud or not.
Then he is given an iPod containing, we know, his favorite music. And immediately he lights up. His face assumes expression, his eyes open wide. He starts to sing and to rock and to move his arms, and he's being animated by the music.
And he used to always sit on the unit with his head like this. He didn't really talk to much people. And then when I introduced the music to him, this is his reaction ever since.
The philosopher Kant once called music the quickening art, and Henry is being quickened, he's being brought to life.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the music for 1 second, okay? Just to ask you a few questions. Okay? I'm going to give it back to you.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
The effect of this doesn't stop, because when the headphones are taken off, Henry, normally mute and virtually unable to answer the simplest yes or no questions, is quite voluble.
Henry.
Yeah.
Do you like the iPod? Do you like the music you're hearing?
Yes.
Tell me about your music.
Well, I don't have one, I mean.
Do you like music?
Yeah, I'm crazy about music. You play beautiful music, beautiful sound. Beautiful.
Did you play music when you were, did you like music when you were young?
Yes, I went to big dances and things.
What was your favorite music when you were young?
Well, I guess, Cab Calloway was my #1 band guy I like.
What's your favorite Cab Calloway song?
Oh, I'll be home there for Christmas. Oh, you can count and plan on me with plenty of snow, mistletoe, present wrapped around your tree. Ow!
So in some sense, Henry is restored to himself. He has remembered who he is, and he's reacquired his identity for a while through the power of music.
What does music do to you?
It give me the feeling of love, romance. Figure right now the world need to come into music, singing. You got beautiful music in. Beautiful, oh, lovely. And I feel the band of love, the dream. The Lord came to me, made me holy. I'm a holy man. So he gave me this sound. I'll just say, I meet you. Let me see. Rosalie, won't you love me? Rosalie, won't you be sweet and kind?
With this beautiful new technology, you can have all the music which is significant for you in something as big as a matchbox or whatever. And I think this may be very, very important in helping to animate, organize, and bring a sense of identity back to people who are out of it. Otherwise, music will bring them back into it, into their own personhood, their own memories, their own autobiographies.
Any responses or reactions when you see that particular? Yeah. Yes, it was. Okay. Like a full-on feature film. Yeah. Yeah, I want to watch it. I show this to my students, and they just get really excited. I'm teaching a course this semester called Humor, Play, and Creativity in Later Life. And I'm trying to prepare them in their final semester of their undergraduate gerontology studies to go out into the world with a more positive sense of the possibilities in aging. Humor hasn't been looked at very much in aging, nor has play. Creativity quite a bit, and even more. Thank you very much. I know that Dr. Moody's own work has contributed a lot to that. But I show this video to my students, and they get super pumped and excited and so forth. Other things that are ways of stimulating narrative activity, I guess to put it in a very simple term, list making. There is a series of books out now that I have the first edition of, or first volume in, called Listography. It didn't take very much for the author to put it together, I don't think. It's just a book that has a blank pages. At the top is a cue to make a list for yourself of pets that you've had, dolls that you've had, hobbies that you've had, and so forth. I mean, it really gets some people going, and it gets them started on a narrative journey that you don't know where that's going to possibly end. Okay, simple reminiscence, storytelling circles. Betsy Pullman has written about that. Writing in different genres. Here's the genius of Kate de Medeiros again, and also of Tom Cole. They developed a particular program from which a video was made called Life Stories, and I show that in my classes on a regular basis. I'm not sure if anybody has seen that 60-minute video called Life Stories. Email Kate de Medeiros or Tom Cole, and they hopefully can find you a DVD of it, as I've got for myself. And it shows a group of about 8 people, older adults, not people living necessarily in institutions, coming around the table. These are people who didn't know each other from before, and they write about their lives. They choose particular stories, because this is kind of focusing on the writing thing, I realize, but they write about things that are important in their memories, but they write about them in different genres, okay? So, for example, they might each write about a particular event that they remember with their mom or their dad, but they write about it in the first person. And then they switch and they write about it in the third person, okay? And it starts to kind of open up other possibilities and other ways of thinking about what that experience has meant for them and what it feels like to them. Or they write about it as a poem, or as a letter to the parent who's no longer alive, okay? And the video that I'm trying to sell here does a wonderful job of showing how that process works, and the way in which those 8 people, they describe themselves as like a sacred gathering, almost. Because even though they don't know each other and don't socialize with each other apart from their time in the group, there's a closeness that develops, what I call a wisdom environment, okay? Guided autobiography. I don't know if you are familiar with the work of Jim Bieran, the late Jim Bieran, who, he was 100 when he passed away. You would know him quite well. Yes, Rick. He and his colleagues developed a wonderful approach called guided autobiography. How many of you have tasted that? Okay, just 1 or 2. So here's how that works. It's sort of like the system that Tom Cole and Kate de Medeiros have used, but it's a little different. So you have a group of maybe 8, 10, 12 people. You could have a bunch of guided autobiography groups here at St. John's on the Lake. Wouldn't that be fun? Okay, and each person goes from the first session. They decide as a group what are the life themes, the guiding life themes that they're going to explore. So they make a list. Well, we're going to each be thinking about education, career, family, spirituality, sexuality, health, money, whatever. Okay. So for they come back after the first week together, and they've each written 2 pages only, on the theme that they decided upon as a group that they were going to write on. So each person reads aloud his or her 2 pages. And questions are asked for clarification, but not critical sort of questions. Then the next person reads his or her 2 pages, and then the next person, and so on and so forth. And then they move on the following week. Then they have some general discussion about common themes and so forth in their life. But following week, they come together, and they've each written 2 pages about the next theme. And so it's a guided autobiographical process. Sometimes if you think, gee, I want to write the story of my life, but where do I start? How do I start? Okay, this is a method that can be quite helpful. And what's really interesting are the benefits that Jim Barron and his colleagues have identified of being part of something like the Guided Autobiography Group, and I'll say more about that shortly. I'm quite confident that you're very familiar with the very important work of Ann Hastings and company here in the Wisconsin area, yes? I think you've had her here at your events, and I very much admire her work. And should I play the time slips video? Okay. All right, so you're familiar with the work that Ann Hastings and her colleagues have been doing, developing a storytelling process that works for people who have significantly advanced forms of dementia. Okay? So they're not necessarily exploring their life stories in an individual, direct kind of way, but they're nonetheless engaging in storytelling activity that taps into bits and pieces and parts of their stories. And you'll see if I show you this little video, which I'm going to do now, the impact and the effect that that has. So bear with me. I know this is what I tell students not to do in group presentations. Don't spend the whole time showing a bunch of YouTube videos. But I think you're okay with that. You're basically saying, yeah, show more videos and talk less. So this is the spotlight from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Hi, Paul. This is your first time. Hey, Pat. Are you going to be okay with everyone here?
Time Slips is really pretty simple. It's improvisational storytelling.
So we're going to write a story today. Are you up for it? Okay.
There is no set course for the story. It all comes from the participants themselves.
To start off, can you tell me what's going on in this picture?
They're hugging.
They're hugging.
It's a radical shift for people with memory loss because our first impulse is to actually go right to memory to try to heal the person.
Why do you think they're happy?
Because it's their wedding anniversary.
It's their wedding anniversary.
And this is particularly powerful for people whose ability to control language is fraying. So it's giving them back that tool to connect with people again.
He has decided that from now on, the next 50 years, I'm going to be the boss.
Okay. All right.
The first moment I realized that something was unique about this method, it was actually kind of a moment of desperation. I had been trying all these memory-based techniques and they weren't working. And so I just tore a picture of the Marlboro Man out of a magazine and I had a big sketch pad like this and I said, say anything you want, let's make up a story.
He thinks, underline, he thinks he's gonna be the boss.
The second I figured out that that worked, that's all I did for the next 12 weeks. I just did the same thing over and over and over again just to see if I could recreate that. And in some ways, I'm doing that 12 years later. And in fact, it works every time, I'm here to say.
Anne is one of those creative visionaries. Sometimes Anne will come to me with an idea, and I have absolutely no idea what she's talking about. And just have gotten to the point of saying, fine, okay, because I know it's going to be great. I just know it's going to be great.
Sometimes the memory doesn't come as easily, right? So you feel comfortable kind of sharing whichever way it comes out.
I mean, Anne is absolutely a star in this community, but she's also a star nationally and internationally.
You know the magic of this is that there's no planning.
No. I think it's her enthusiasm and her ideas and her belief that we should have high expectations of the imagination and the creative spirit of people with dementia. She's always pushing us in a good way to think bigger and to think something that can really revolutionize and reinvent long-term care.
It's not up to me. No. It's your story.
I think UWM, for me, the most important thing about working there is this feeling that you can make it happen. I have a career of working in the cracks of in between things, in between departments, in between disciplines, in between university community. And it's a really ripe community for making those kind of things happen, those kind of projects happen, those collaborations. And it's a place that has a need for it too. So there's an enthusiasm for that kind of work and an acceptance for it and open doors, frankly.
So how are we going to end our story?
I think I love what I do because it allows you to tap almost immediately into the essence of humanity.
Bernie says, when does my control start? And Julianne says, that's what you think.
Sitting in on the story today, there's still moments of magic.
Hallelujah. Thank you, God.
Very nice. Good story. Good story.
There's a colleague of ours in Canada at McMaster University, Ellen Ryan. She's a professor emeritus at McMaster University, and she's been doing similar kinds of things, perhaps inspired by Anne's work and so forth. I'll say a couple more things about another approach which I've been recently exposed to called therapeutic reenactment. We had a speaker last year at our Narrative Center at St. Thomas University called Marvin Westwood. And Marvin has been regularly involved with the International Institute for Life Review and Reminiscence, which I know has been based here at Superior, in the University of Wisconsin Superior. Is that correct? Yeah. Anyway, so Marv Westwood is part of that network, and from Vancouver, a professor of counseling psychology, and he has had a particular passion, almost a ministry. I mean, he talks about he's strong Anglican. I guess that's the equivalent of Episcopalian in Canada, and he speaks about it personally as a sense of mission almost for the guys, particularly the guys coming back from Afghanistan and other conflict regions who are wrestling with the ravages in their lives and their families' lives of PTSD and just can't move on. It's a form of narrative disruption or whatever you want to call it. So he's developed with his colleagues, including David Kuhl, whom I'm going to say a little bit more about shortly, a unique approach which they call therapeutic reenactment. We're in a very safe environment with fellow veterans who've worked through some of the trauma issues themselves, using a combination of psychodrama, narrative therapy, and life review. They reenact the original incident that's causing that young person, shall we say, to be stuck in the trauma, not being able to save their buddy who had been blown up in an armored vehicle somewhere in a conflict zone. Okay. And the testimonies of the veterans who've gone through this is absolutely heart-wrenching as they find themselves being restored to their lives and to getting out of the reliance that they had upon pills and medication and the suicidal urges and so forth, and moving forward and kind of getting back into their story, shall we say, in a way that they can move forward. Okay. Another colleague of ours who works now a lot with David Westwood, with Marvin Westwood, his name is Richard Lafleur. Richard Lafleur is a postdoctoral student of Mark Freeman at College of the Holy Cross, an African-American psychologist who at the same time is also, he's a director of pastoral care for a congregation in Atlanta of about 10,000 parishioners. Okay. He's a marvelous guy. He's been up to my house in Canada last fall, and he's helping to plan the Narrative Matters 2020 conference. But he and Marvin Westwood, whom I mentioned earlier, have teamed up because Richard Lafleur has developed with his staff at the church with 10,000 people a special program aimed at Vietnam vets called Just Listening. Just Listening. That's the title of it, and that's what they do. They open the doors of the church to a particular meeting room or whatever, and these vets who are having real difficult times trying to keep on keeping on have a chance to come in and just tell their stories in an environment that's gentle and safe, what I would call a wisdom environment, healing environment, and they have a talking feather or a speaking stone or whatever, and each person gets to talk for however long they need to, and that's all they do, just listen, which is, I think, narrative care in its most soulful kind of format. Plain old conversation to me is you can't beat it. Creative activity of any kind. Random objects are special. I use a little technique sometimes at the beginning of a narrative gerontology course where I come in to the classroom and I empty out a bag full of random objects that I've got from my house, okay? And now that I've decluttered, I don't have quite so many of those random objects. But there might be a clothespin, there might be a golf ball, there might be a pair of binoculars, there might be a this or that or whatever. I lay them out on the table and I invite the students to pick one that speaks to them, triggers some sort of memory, and that's how we start the class. People introduce themselves to the rest of the class by telling a little story that's triggered for them by that particular object. And as we speak, we have a book contract that's finally come through, myself and our colleagues at the Narrative Center, to write a book which we've given the tentative title, Things That Matter, Resilience, Reminiscence, and the Role of Special Objects in the Stories of Our Lives. Because in our research, we found that the people whom we've interviewed, the older adults, often will refer to particular objects, whether they're letters that they've held on to from an old boyfriend way, way back, or they're pictures that they've kept on, hanging on to, whatever it might be. Those objects got mentioned in the interviews, and we realized that those objects are like metaphors for aspects of their lives. Are doorways into corners of their lives that are worth reflecting on. So that's what our book project's going to be. There's one of our participants talks about a beer stein. I guess they have beer here in Wisconsin, Milwaukee. I've heard something about that. And along with the cheese, beer and cheese, not wine and cheese, but beer and cheese. Anyway, she's held on to this beer stein because it was found in the ruins of an old house somewhere in rural England where she started out her life as an illegitimate child and came to Canada and has lived this whole life of not really knowing who her real parents were. But somehow or other, in the trip that was made back, they found this beer stein that proves to her that, yes, the way I thought my life started out actually was so. So that's a cherished object for her that beer stein holds so much symbolic significance for her about what her whole life has been in a good kind of way. So, you know, I mean, anything. It's not, what are some of the benefits of life storytelling? Well, I think I've gone through a number of them that I can think of, but one of them came up in conversation with Karen Scarrett over lunch today, and it's sort of basically an improved immune system. James Pennebaker, who teaches at the university, or did teach at the University of Texas, and did a lot of research where he would invite university students to write out in a kind of a journal format some particular troubling or even traumatic or difficult incident from their past, okay, to write it out, get it out of themselves onto the page. And I don't know the details of the research project, but they found that those students reported a much better sense of well-being after getting that thing out, getting some affectionate detachment on that particular event or whatever it was, getting it on paper. And not only did they have a better sense of purpose and meaning and significance in their life, better self-esteem, but somehow they measured their immune system, and it had improved. Somebody, I'm sure, knows what the particular biochemical agent would be that would give you a sense of how strong your immune system was. I don't know what that would be. But Karen, you were, pardon me? Cortisol, yeah. Well, whatever it was. So that's a pretty, but I think, I don't know, I felt that when I was a minister, I didn't know really what I was doing half the time. I would go to visit people in the afternoon, such as this afternoon, after lunch when everybody and their dog, including myself, is sleepy. But I had this list of people I needed to visit, and I would go to the apartment of person X or person Y, knock on the door, and they'd introduce me, or they welcome me in, usher me into the living room where nobody ever lived, okay? But the preacher was taken in there. And they would go into the kitchen to get a tray of coffee or tea and cookies and so forth, which was the last thing I needed, something more to eat to make me sleepy. But while they were out there in the kitchen, I'd be looking around the living room at the pictures and the mementos and so forth. And by the time they came back in with the tray, I had a question. So that picture there that you, I think it's you, isn't it, and that man, it was at Niagara Falls, what's that about? Well, that was my first husband, Ralph. And we had quite a time, blah, 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 blah. You know. By the time the hour is up, the stories are flowing, the energy is rising, we're both wide awake, and as I leave to go on to my next appointment, the person's shaking my hand. Thank you so much. I didn't do anything. All right, I just listened or thought I was listening, and they were telling stories about important things in their lives. And whatever was going on for them physically or health-wise, I felt that maybe a little bit of improvement had taken place. Okay, so some of the benefits are decreased anxiety, resolution of past hurts, maybe achieving a healthy sense of closure as opposed to foreclosure, and untangling some of those narrative knots that I referred to earlier, and maybe restarting a stalled life story. Increased narrative openness, and I think the list could go on. Possibly a benefit of life storytelling or narrative care activities could be, besides this ripple effect that I referred to earlier throughout the whole institution, a regeneration of our lives. I use the term genre to refer to, tragedy versus comedy versus satire and so forth, okay? You know that from English 101. So here's Harry Berman. I'm sure, Rick, you would know, yep. And I really admire this book, which is, I haven't kept up with his career, but this book here has been an important book for me, called Interpreting the Aging Self, Personal Journals in Later Life. And basically he's done a study of journal keeping among older adults, and he's picked some, particularly famous journal keepers like Florida Scott Maxwell and May Sarton and so forth. And he's tried to analyze what happens in the lives of such people as you go from their early journals to their later journals, what's happened for them and to them by virtue of keeping the journal, okay? And so he has this interesting thing to say. He says, it may become apparent to the journal keeper that we were not in the middle of the story that we thought we were in the middle of. Perhaps we thought our life was a tragedy, and all along, unbeknownst to us, it was a romance. Or perhaps we thought our life was almost over, narrative foreclosure, at least in terms of the future holding anything new, and it turned out there was a lot more to it. Has anybody here had that kind of feeling sometimes when you began to do some journaling about your life? Think about that. I don't know what the time is. I think, Kent, we're rushing to the conclusion, are we not? 20 minutes. All right. Here I'm going to say a little bit about something I have no business, pardon me? I'm going to say something that I really don't have any business saying anything about, because I'm by no means an expert in working with older adults in mental health sort of context as a therapist or a counselor. But looking at things from a narrative perspective, and this is the work of my Dutch colleagues, Ernst Bollmeyer and Herman Westerhoff, in their use of life review therapy with older adults experiencing some depression, where they found that there were some positive results of taking them through this process. They found that older adults with depressive symptoms tend to tell over general sort of memories or stories about their life. Well, I don't know, I grew up on a farm and I worked all my years in the factory and here I am. Oh, okay. So the focus of the therapy is to help them access specific stories, specific positive stories. It's a kind of a narrative therapy technique in a way, and helps to bring out starts to bring out a more positive version of the individual's life that they can then sort of start to move from. Okay. Persons with depression may be overwhelmed with challenges to their identity. Maybe that narrative challenge dimension needs to be factored in. May experience narrative foreclosure. In fact, my Dutch colleagues make a special point in an article they've written on narrative foreclosure in the Journal of Aging Studies that there are connections in their view between depression in later life and something like narrative foreclosure. May benefit from a life review therapy, I mentioned that, and may be amid a crisis of meaning due to under-narration. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. How about the dementia situation? Those things to consider in working with those with dementia, where I'm way out of my league, and Ann Basting and others are much, much more aware of what's going on. But perhaps one of the things to consider is that persons with dementia are subjected by us or other people or family members without knowing it and unwittingly, with the best of intentions, to a degree of narrative dispossession. I mean, the diagnosis, you have dementia, is an invitation for others perhaps to start to move into narrative dispossession mode. I don't know. I wrote a paper on the fine line between normal memory and dementing memory, because I think that a lot of our memories that when we think we're very normal are tangled with other people's memories, and there's blurrings and so forth. I can tell you more about that. Here's where my colleague Clive Baldwin's genius comes to play. He's written a wonderful paper on narrative dispossession with persons with dementia, and he says we need to reconceive what we understand narrative coherence to be, what a good story is. And he suggested that as was coming forth, I think, in the video on Henry in Alive Inside, and it was coming forth in the video of the Ann Basting Initiative, there are patches, okay, that can be patched together in a kind of a narrative quilt. So it's a different way of conceiving narrative coherence. And I know a new book's coming out by Lars Christer Heiden that explores narrative scaffolding with persons who have dementia. I don't know, but I know it's a very good book, and I have to read it. But so the thing is to enter their story world. Here I can give you a quick narrative from my own life. When I was a minister in Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan, I had to go visit Mrs. Jacobs, who I didn't need to because she was a Lutheran and I was United Church. But I thought, what the heck. So I went in to visit her, and I don't think I knew her didn't know very much about her, but I walked into her room, and she was in the middle of a real stew. She said, we got to go out. She was lying in her bed. She was in the hospital. We got to go out there and get them horses and get them back in the barn because there's a storm coming. And I didn't know what to do exactly, so I sort of decided to go with the flow. And I entered the story world that I thought that she was in as best as I could. And I said, well, how can I help? You know, well, you got to go out there. If they don't, because Jack's coming home pretty soon. She was back to being a young mom with a bunch of kids, a storm coming, and the horses were out. Okay? I'd like to think that at the end of that conversation, she was settled back down again, but I don't remember exactly. Maybe she was worse off than ever. I don't know. And they're probably trying to track me down. Lastly, things to consider with those who are dying. Way out of my league here. But I think it's fair to say that those who are in a palliative situation, perhaps in a hospice context, are feeling extra nudged toward the spiritual, the transcendent, have a heightened urge to life review. Here I make reference to my friend David Kuhl, K-U-H-L, from Vancouver, who was a palliative care physician who went back to school to get his PhD in psychological counseling. And he decided, with permission, to interview his palliative patients about what they wanted. All right? So he wrote a book called What Dying People Want. And guess what? It got him on the Oprah Winfrey Show. So one of the things he found that they want is to tell the truth. They want truth-telling. They don't want any, fake news or whatever. They want people to be honest and clear. And they want to engage in life review in one way or another. We have a colleague in Fredericton, Judith Tompkins, who's developed a marvelous innovation, I think it's marvelous, where she goes to, she's part of our Hospice Fredericton volunteer network. She goes to homes of people and talks to them about their life and says, would you like me to do a photo album about your life? Okay? So they will say, yes, please. And they and she round up a bunch of photographs. She puts them together using some kind of a Mac program, creates a book, presents the book with the pictures of their various stages of their life. It's not text, it's pictures. But pictures say 1,000 words. And I get her to come to my class each year to talk about that particular innovation. The last thing I want to say is that older adults may be open to positive storyings of death and beyond. Some writer has described death as the most open-ended ending because we don't know so much, okay? But perhaps there will be opportunities when you're working with or sitting with, volunteering with, listening to an older adult on the edge of this life to think, if they are open, of the next chapter, or of death as a transition to the great adventure, or simply to the other side. And here's a quote, a transition to a horizon beyond which the five senses cannot see. Well, I'm conscious of time. I want to leave some time for questions. Wonderful book by Christina Baldwin called Story Catcher. And you know about dream catchers, okay? Those things that people have in their cars. So she's written a book called Story Catcher, and she says, story catchers come whenever we are in crisis to remind us who we are. Story catchers entice our best tales out of us as they turn with a leading question, a waiting ear, and their full attention. I think in this room we have a lot of story catchers, okay? And you are to be praised. A story companion is the other phrase I mentioned to you before. This is Karen Scheib. Her book called Pastoral Care, telling the stories of our lives. The practice of narrative pastoral care invites us to become story companions to one another. Not clinicians, not experts on somebody else's life, but story companions with them in their life. And lastly, the work of Janet Ruffing from Yale Divinity School, who is a professor of pastoral theology who specializes in spiritual direction. I'm sure there are many people out here who are familiar with her work. We had her a couple of years ago as a keynote speaker at a conference in Fredericton. And she writes about the art of listening sacred stories into speech. I'm way out of my league here, but I do think we're treading on holy territory when we're interacting with people and they're sharing with us things that they might not share with other people. If you've ever had somebody say to you, I've never told this to anyone before, but holy, holy, holy. Pay attention. All antenna must be up. Wrapping up, narrative care is not rocket science. It's not expensive, really, compared to technologies and medications, and I like to think that some people could just benefit from a good dose of narrative care. It's as vital as other kinds of care. It's emotional care, spiritual care, and patient-centered care all in one. And it's perhaps most important, it's a relationship and not a task. People will say, oh, well, I don't have time for that. It's just one more thing I have to add to my list. True, maybe, but it's about a quality of connection, a relationship. It's implicitly therapeutic or therapoetic, as I like to say. And it's core care because it goes to the cœur. If you have a French background, the heart of who a person is and the soul of who one is. And perhaps for those of us in the helping professions, it's what drew us into helping professions in the first place. And lastly, it begins at home. I like to say to my students and other people that we really can't appreciate how rich and interesting and layered and complex and multidimensional other people's stories are until we start to appreciate just how rich and interesting and multi-leveled and multidimensional our own stories are. And there's ways to do that. You know them better than I do. Memoir writing, journaling, conversation. Becoming a therapist itself invites you to dig into your own storied life. And here's the work of Jeffrey Kotler. Some of you have read his book on being a therapist. He has a whole chapter on storytelling and story listening. And at the end of that chapter, he says, here's some questions that you, readers of this book, can ask to dig into your own storied life. And he says, think about a story that's had a powerful impact on your life. What is a story that you frequently tell someone that you meet who you want to truly know you? What's a signature story, in other words? What are some of your favorite teaching tales, and what is a significant experience in your life that you haven't yet formed into a coherent story? I got some questions that I like to ask of signature stories. For example, my iron lung story. What's in that story? I'm sure I'm going to go home from this event and dig back into that story again, because there's more in that I want to play around with. But I think I will, pictures of more books, and there we go. So that's all I have to say for now, but let's have some conversation. Thank you for your patience.